she was 20 and homeless. No lease, no car, no room waiting anywhere. Just a canvas backpack with one broken zipper and $3 she had kept folded inside the paper sleeve of her library card. And with that $3, she bought a brick letterpress shop, shuttered and rain-blackened outside intercourse, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the place had fallen off county maps in 1958. The back wall had bowed 3 inches toward the alley. The roof let rain through in 6 separate places. The county had condemned it since 2001 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the iron-type cabinet beneath a false back panel, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elara Mae Whitcomb had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. Not the kind of waiting that sits by a window with a clock in sight, or the kind that grows impatient and sharp from being denied. Hers was a quieter thing, learned before she had language for it. She waited in checkout lines while her mother counted coupons under her breath. She waited at kitchen tables while adults lowered their voices in the next room. She waited beside locked office doors, outside classrooms, stairwells that smelled of floor wax and wet mittens, learning early that a child could make herself smaller by holding still. She had been born in a narrow rental house in York, Pennsylvania, where the Susquehanna moved broad and brown beyond the mill buildings, and where winter arrived not with drama but with a patient hardening of gutters, porch steps, and the edges of old snow. Her earliest rooms had low ceilings, lace curtains yellowed by cooking steam, and a refrigerator whose motor hummed through the night like some tired creature asked to keep breathing. Her mother, Lillian, worked the front desk at a dental clinic and wore shoes with quiet rubber soles. In the evening she came home smelling faintly of antiseptic and spearmint, her hands dry from soap, her face careful in the way of women who have spent the day being pleasant for wages. She did not sing while she cooked, but sometimes she touched Elara's hair as she passed behind her chair, 2 fingers only, almost an apology. There had once been a father in the house, though Elara remembered him mostly through absence and a few objects that kept his shape. A wool cap in the hall closet, a photograph of him standing beside a lake with his hands in his pockets, a brass ruler, 12 inches long, engraved with his initials, kept in the drawer with batteries, bread ties, and expired warranties. His name was Samuel Whitcomb, and he had repaired farm machinery until a winter highway took him away when Elara was 5. After that, adults spoke of him with the softened voices they used for weather damage and unpaid bills. Lillian did not break at once. She became exact. She labeled jars. She saved envelopes. She marked every due date on a calendar from the funeral home, and each little square was filled in blue ink. Rent, heat, insurance, dentist, tuition. It was not grief Elara saw then, but arithmetic. Her mother stood at the stove and turned numbers over in her mind while onions browned and laundry thumped behind the basement door. For years, that was how love appeared to Elara. Not grandly, not with speeches. Love was a lunch packed before dawn, a coat mended from the inside so the patch did not show, a library book returned on time because the fine would be 25 cents. Love was exact and tired and almost silent. Then, when Elara was 9, her mother married Martin Greaves. He came into the house with a tan work jacket, polished shoes, and a habit of wiping his thumb across the rim of every glass before he drank. He sold insurance then, or said he did, though his employment seemed to move from office to office without leaving any firm address behind. He called Lillian practical. He called Elara quiet, as if it were a flaw he had noticed in a wall. At first he brought order that looked like safety. A second income. A newer used car. A lock repaired on the back door. He carried groceries in 2 bags at a time and set them on the counter with a little grunt of ownership. He spoke of budgets, discipline, and getting ahead. Lillian listened because she had spent 4 years trying not to sink, and a man who spoke in plans can sound, to a weary woman, like dry land. But Elara's true education did not happen in that house. It happened 42 miles east, on Saturdays. In Lancaster County, inside her grandfather's converted carriage shed, where the air held the mineral scent of ink, oiled metal, paper dust, and wood that had absorbed a century of weather. Elias Whitcomb was Samuel's father, a retired printer with wide hands, clouded blue eyes, and a voice that seemed to have been worn smooth by long use. He lived in a clapboard farmhouse outside Strasburg, near fields where Amish buggies passed at dusk with lanterns trembling under the black hoods. He did not own a television. He kept time by church bells, freight whistles, and the particular slant of light on the barn wall. Every other Friday evening, when Lillian could spare the gas or when Elias drove west himself in his green Plymouth, Elara went to him with a canvas overnight bag and came back Sunday smelling faintly of ink. He taught her the old thing slowly, never in the manner of a man trying to impress a child, but as if the work itself deserved courtesy. He showed her how to wash her hands before touching clean paper, and then how to get them dirty in honest ways. He opened cases of lead type and named the letters, not as marks on a page, but as small, weighty bodies. Garamond, Caslin, Bodoni, Cheltenham. Each letter lived in its own compartment. Each space mattered. Each line had to be locked into the chase with furniture and coins until nothing rattled. On winter mornings the shed stove ticked and settled while Elias rolled black ink across the platen press. Elara stood on a wooden crate to see the form. He would let her set her name first, letter by letter, backward, her tongue resting between her teeth as she searched the California job case. Lowercase e, lowercase l, lowercase a. He taught her to feel the nick on each piece of type so she would not place it upside down. He taught her that a printed page was made by pressure, but also restraint. Too little pressure, and the paper would not remember. Too much, and the sheet would bruise. At noon they ate potato soup from heavy bowls and slices of bread wrapped in waxed paper. Sometimes he took down one of his worn manuals and read a paragraph aloud about make-ready, leading, imposition, or grain direction. Sometimes he said nothing for an hour, and the silence between them was never empty. It held sorting, wiping, measuring, breathing. It held trust. In spring, he showed her how to sew pamphlets with linen thread. In summer, how to trim signatures with a bone folder and a dull knife sharpened on a stone. In autumn, how to mix a brown ink that looked almost black until sunlight found the red in it. He gave her a composing stick when she was 11 and a printer's apron when she was 13, the canvas stiff at first and later softened by her own movements. On the inside pocket of that apron, he stitched her initials in blue thread. He had rules. No food near type. Never force a drawer. Never leave ink to harden on a roller. Never throw away a scrap of good paper unless it could not be used for notes, labels, or testing. His rules were practical, but beneath them ran a deeper lesson that things made by hand carried a portion of the maker's attention, and attention was a form of care. One November afternoon, when rain moved in gray strings across the fields and the shed windows fogged at the corners, Elara dropped a full line of set type onto the floor. The pieces scattered under the galley table and the press, tiny lead rectangles disappearing into dust and shadow. She froze, expecting the quick reprimand she had grown used to at home. Elias only lowered himself onto one knee with some difficulty and handed her the magnet. "Nothing honest is ruined by being carefully gathered," he said at once. He did not explain it. Years later, she would understand that he had not been speaking only of letters. After that day, when something in her went wrong, when a test came back marked in red, when Martin's voice moved through the house like a door closing, when Lillian's face became too tired to read, Elara would see her grandfather's hands under the press, picking up one small fallen thing after another. Patiently, without accusation. Elias died in March of her 17th year, after a winter cough became pneumonia, and pneumonia found the weakness in him no doctor could mend. Lillian drove Elara to the funeral through a wet snow that clung to fence wire and maple bark. At the church, the hymnals smelled of dust and wool coats, and the old printers who came to pay respects stood in the back with their hats in their hands. Elara wore the blue-stitched apron under her black sweater because she could not bear to leave it behind. After the burial, things vanished in the usual way of estates without clear guardians. A cousin took the Plymouth. A neighbor bought the farm tools. The presses, too heavy to move easily, were sold for less than their worth to a collector from Harrisburg. Cases of type went in lots, their neat alphabets broken and carried into trucks by men who did not know which drawer held the ligatures. Elara asked about the composing stick, the manuals, the bone folder with the worn thumb mark. Lillian looked toward Martin before she answered. "We cannot keep everything," she said. Martin stood near the shed door, with a clipboard he had brought himself. The gesture was clean and official, though no one had asked him to be official. He told a man from the auction company that lead type was hazardous, and that sentiment did not pay storage fees. He smiled while saying it. That was one of his habits. He smiled as if the world had already agreed with him. The apron stayed with Elara because she had hidden it at the bottom of her overnight bag. Everything else entered absence. By 18, she had learned to live with the particular climate Martin made. He was not a man who broke plates or shouted in parking lots. He did not need to. He made the house colder by entering it. He read bills at the kitchen table with a pencil behind his ear and circled figures as though circling evidence. He asked questions in the tone of a person who had already decided the answer was unsatisfactory. How much was the application fee? Why did a state school still cost that much? Was graphic design a real course of study or a decorated word for unemployment? Did she understand that scholarships were not charity for girls who liked pretty paper? Elara would stand with one hand on the back of a chair and answer evenly. Yes, she understood. Yes, she had applied. Yes, she was working at the grocery on weekends. Yes, she knew money was tight. The college fund had existed in a blue passbook once. Samuel's settlement, Lillian's deposits, Elias's birthday checks, small tax refunds saved instead of spent. Elara had seen the balance when she was 14, then again at 16. Enough not for ease, but for a beginning. Enough for tuition if she lived cheaply, worked steadily, and did not ask for much. After Elias died, Martin said it made sense for him to manage the account. Better interest. Cleaner records. Adult oversight. Lillian signed the papers at the kitchen table while Elara washed dishes and watched their reflections in the dark window above the sink. By the time the acceptance letter came, there was nothing left but explanations. Market loss. Emergency repairs. an investment that had not matured, a temporary transfer, a misunderstanding at the bank. Martin had many phrases, all of them arranged to leave no single place where blame could sit. The truth had another smell to it. Cigarette smoke on his coat, though he claimed to have quit. Mud on his shoes from a casino lot outside Grantville. Phone calls taken on the porch in February cold. A red past due notice folded into fourths and tucked behind the flour canister, where Elara found it while looking for baking powder. She said nothing at first. Not because she did not understand, but because her mother was in the next room humming without music while hemming a skirt for the clinic, and some knowledge enters a house like smoke under a door. It cannot be unseen, but it can be refused air for a while. The refusal ended on August 17, the summer after Elara turned 20. The day was hot and airless, the kind of Pennsylvania heat that made window screens smell metallic. Elara came home from a double shift at the grocery with sweat-dried white at the edges of her black polo shirt. Her backpack held 2 library books on bookbinding, a heel of bread wrapped in a napkin, and the final email from the college bursar, polite as a closed gate. Her key did not work. At first she thought the lock had swollen. She tried again, lifting the door as Samuel had once taught Lillian to do when the old hinges sagged. The bolt turned halfway and stopped. From inside came the measured sound of footsteps. Martin opened the door with the chain still on. Behind him, the hallway looked dim and narrow. A cardboard box sat at his feet. On top of it lay her winter coat, though it was August, folded with deliberate neatness. Beside it were the apron, the brass ruler, 3 pairs of socks, and the photograph of Samuel by the lake. He had chosen the objects carefully. Enough to prove he had not been cruel. Not enough to let her stay. Lillian stood at the end of the hall near the kitchen entrance, both hands wrapped around a dish towel. She did not come forward. Her eyes moved once to the box and then to the floor. Martin slid the chain free and opened the door only wide enough for the box. "You are grown now. Take what is yours." 8 words. He had prepared them. Elara could tell by the way they came out smooth. She looked past him to her mother. The hallway fan turned slowly above them, pushing warm air from one room to another without cooling anything. Lillian's mouth trembled, but no sound came. She folded the towel once, then again, making a smaller square. Elara bent and lifted the box. It was heavier than she expected because grief has weight when packed with shoes. The corner pressed into her hip. Martin closed the door before she reached the steps. The new lock clicked. She did not knock. She did not plead. She did not call anyone from the curb. For a long minute she stood under the porch light, though it was not yet dark, with the box in her arms and her backpack cutting into one shoulder. A cicada shrilled from the maple tree. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and stopped. Then she set the box on the sidewalk and repacked her life. The apron went into the backpack first, folded around the brass ruler. The photograph slid between the 2 library books. The socks, the coat, and 1 sweater were rolled tight and tied with the apron strings because the zipper had broken months before. She left the cardboard box by the curb, empty except for a single hanger and a grocery receipt that had clung to the bottom. By midnight she was on a bus to Harrisburg with $13.82, 2 bruised apples from the grocery break room, and no plan she trusted enough to name. The first night she slept in the Harrisburg Transportation Center, upright on a molded plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights that never dimmed. A janitor passed at 3 a.m. and did not wake her. At dawn she washed her face in the restroom with pink soap that smelled like cherries and metal. She changed shirts in a stall, folded her work polo into the bottom of the backpack, and walked to the river because water, even city water, gave the morning some form of mercy. For 6 weeks she moved the way people move when they do not want anyone to count them. Harrisburg first. Then Middletown, where she slept behind a church shed on a bed of flattened cardboard and woke with dew in her hair. Then Elizabethtown, where she spent 2 nights in the laundromat, feeding quarters she could not spare into a dryer she had not filled, just to have a reason to sit. Then Lancaster, reached in rain, its brick sidewalks shining under street lamps, its old market building closed for the night, its benches too exposed for sleep. She learned which public restrooms locked at dusk and which did not. She learned that hospital waiting rooms were watched more closely after midnight. She learned that a person could read the same paragraph for 20 minutes in a library and still be grateful for the chair. She learned that hunger sharpened smell before it weakened the body. Coffee through a cafe door. Frying onions from a lunch counter. Sweet feed from a farm supply store. Wet newspaper in a bus shelter after rain. Her money diminished in exact increments. $1.75 for a bus fare. 99 cents for a day-old roll. $3 for a locker when the backpack made her shoulder throb. $1 for a thrift store scarf because September nights had begun to change. She kept the remaining bills folded inside the paper sleeve of her library card, the same way she had once kept notes from Elias, because paper within paper felt safer than a wallet. She did not call Lillian. There were payphones in some stations, and once, in Lancaster, she stood with the receiver in her hand and her finger above the buttons. She imagined the clinic, the front desk, her mother's practical voice saying the name of the dentist. She imagined the pause after recognition. Behind that pause, she imagined Martin entering the room, or perhaps only the shadow of his listening. Elara hung the receiver back in its cradle without dialing. To survive without becoming hard, she made rituals where she could. At the Lancaster Public Library, she washed carefully, dried her hands on the air machine until the skin tightened, then climbed to the local history room. There, under high windows, she read old newspapers on microfilm and county histories with cracked bindings. Not for school, not for anyone's approval. The pages were simply there, and they allowed her to be a person with interest instead of a problem with feet. She read about German printers who brought presses into Pennsylvania valleys, about almanacs printed in blackletter, about broadsides announcing auctions, births, sermons, losses. She read about Mennonite binders, Amish farms, traveling salesmen with sample books, and the Great Patient, labor by which ordinary communities kept their own records before the world became impatient with paper. The reading steadied her. It made a bridge back to Elias without requiring memory to become too sharp. One Thursday near the end of September, rain kept coming down in thin lines from a low sky, and the library filled with the smell of damp coats. Elara had $11 left, then $9 after soup, then $7 when she bought a roll of clear tape to repair the backpack zipper badly enough for another week. She went upstairs because the local history room was warm and because no one there asked why she had nowhere else to be. On a side table near the microfilm cabinets lay a stack of county notices, auction flyers, and public sale sheets printed on low-grade paper. Most had been handled until the corners curled. Farm equipment, estate furniture, tax-delinquent parcels, commercial remnants. She turned them over one by one because her hands needed occupation while her mind kept a careful distance from the coming night. The notice was half hidden beneath an announcement for a poultry equipment sale in Quarryville. Lancaster County Sheriff's Sale. Non-conforming instruction. Former printing premise. Union have. Minimum bid. 3. Buyer assumes all liens. Fees. And demolition responsibility. Below that, In smaller type was an address outside intercourse, a parcel number, and a date already postponed twice. There was no photograph, only a brief legal description, dry and dismissive, with the words brick shop, former letterpress operation, condemned. Elara read the notice once, then set it down. The rain ticked against the window. Across the room, an old man turned a newspaper page with such care that the sound was almost cloth. Somewhere below, in the children's section, a mother whispered for a child to lower his voice. Elara picked the notice up again. Former printing premises. The phrase was not beautiful. It was county language, stripped of affection. Yet beneath it she felt the shape of drawers, rollers, timpan paper, lead and ink, the little nick on each piece of type. She saw Elias wiping the press bed with a rag, his sleeves rolled, his head bowed not in defeat but attention. Minimum bid $3. She opened a paper sleeve behind her library card and counted what remained. 1 5, 2 1s, some coins. Enough to eat twice, if she chose carefully. Enough to buy a bus ride partway and walk the rest. Enough, strangely, for a building no one wanted. The decision did not arrive as courage. It came as a narrowing of other choices. She had no landlord to disappoint, no room to lose, no parent waiting with a porch light, no school expecting payment. The world had already taken the shape of a road beneath her feet, and here, for the first time in 6 weeks, was a door, even if the door belonged to a condemned shop with a bowed wall and rain going through the roof. She copied the address onto the back of a grocery receipt with the library pencil. Then she folded the sale notice along its old creases and placed it inside the bookbinding manual beside the chapter on repairing broken spines. At closing time, the librarian with silver hair touched the switch on the desk lamp and told her gently that the room was shutting for the evening. Elara nodded, gathered her backpack, and walked downstairs without hurry. Outside, the rain had softened to mist. Cars hissed along Duke Street. The city lights blurred in the wet pavement like ink not yet dry. She spent that night under the covered entrance of a closed tailor shop, sitting upright with her coat around her knees and the backpack against her chest. Sleep came and left in fragments. Each time she woke, she touched the folded notice through the canvas as if it might have disappeared. In the morning she bought no breakfast. She walked to the bus station, paid for the cheapest route east, and kept the last $3 untouched in the paper sleeve of her library card. By afternoon, with the sky clearing over the fields and the smell of manure and wet corn rising from the land, she stepped down onto the shoulder of a county road and began walking toward a town where buggies passed slowly, laundry lifted on lines, and somewhere beyond the next rise, a forgotten letterpress shop waited under its condemned roof. The bus left her beside a feed store sign with sun-faded red letters and a strip of gravel shoulder that fell away into a ditch full of goldenrod. For a moment Elara stood still with the backpack pulling at the sore muscle below her collarbone, while the bus breathed once, folded its door shut, and went on east without her. Its red light shrank between cornfields and a row of maples already touched with October color. Then even the engine sound was gone, taken into the broad, worked silence of Lancaster County. The driver had let her off at the closest stop he knew, though he had warned her it was not close in any useful way. 12 miles by his estimate. 10 if she cut along farm lanes. More if she made a wrong turn or if a bridge was out, which he said happened sometimes after hard rain. She had thanked him because he had given the warning without contempt. That mattered. The afternoon was cool enough for walking and warm enough to make the coat a burden. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, with clouds like thin wool dragged across it, and a smell of damp earth rose from the fields where corn stubble stood in rows. She passed a white farmhouse with green shutters, then a dairy barn with black and white cows gathered near the fence, their jaws moving steadily as if time were something they could chew and soften. Buggies passed now and then, wheels hissing over wet patches in the road. Men in dark hats lifted 2 fingers from the reins. Women looked forward beneath black bonnets, their faces composed in that careful way people have when passing strangers but not judging them aloud. Elara kept to the shoulder when there was one and stepped into grass when trucks came too fast around the bends. By 4 o'clock her left heel had begun to burn. By 5, she had drunk the last of the water from the library fountain bottle and eaten 1 apple down to its seeds. By 6, the fields had darkened from green gold to a low brown, and the temperature was falling with the sun. She found the hay barn after missing the turn twice. It stood back from a lane, open on one side, its boards weathered silver and its roof patched in 3 kinds of tin. No house light shone close enough to make her bold, but no dog barked either, and the coming dark had a weight to it. She stood at the threshold and listened. Wind in the rafters, dry stems shifting, a mouse or bird moving somewhere above. She went in. There was not much hay left, only loose chaff and several square bales stacked near the back wall beneath an old pulley. The air was sweet with dust, mold, and the dry green memory of summer. She climbed onto the lowest bales and pulled her coat around her knees. Her backpack became a pillow. Her shoes stayed on because the night had already begun to bite through the boards. At some hour after midnight, she woke so cold her teeth tapped before she could stop them. Later she would hear from a man at the hardware store that the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees that night. She would remember it because the number seemed too mild for how cold it had felt in her bones. Numbers often behave that way. They stood straight and reasonable while the body knew otherwise. She slept in pieces. A rooster called before the light. A truck started somewhere beyond the lane. The barn took shape around her slowly, beam by beam, like a print emerging from pressure. She brushed hay from her sleeves, tightened the apron strings around the backpack where the zipper failed, and stepped outside into a morning silvered with frost. Her breath showed. She walked the remaining miles with stiff knees and a hollow stomach, past corn cribs, mailboxes, roadside stands closed for the season, and farmhouses with quilts of pale smoke lying above their chimneys. Twice she stopped to study the grocery receipt where she had copied the directions. Once she took the wrong fork and had to turn back after a half-mile, the mistake costing her more than distance. It cost spirit. She sat on a flat stone by a culvert and pressed her thumb into the heel blister until the pain became exact. Then she stood and went on. Intercourse appeared not suddenly but by gathering. First a line of buggy sheds, then a sign for handmade quilts, then a bakery with the morning smell of yeast and cinnamon slipping through its doors, then the fuller shape of a village arranged for both work and visitors, its sidewalks swept clean, its storefronts plain and tidy under painted signs. She passed 5 businesses before she found the county annex where the sale would be completed. There was a quilt shop with blue stars hanging in the window, each point stitched so neatly it looked almost severe. There was a dry goods store with bolts of fabric stacked behind glass and a hand-lettered sign for canning lids. There was a bakery called Miller's Hearth, where 2 women in aprons set trays of rolls near the front counter. There was a harness shop with the clean animal smell of leather, oil, and brass buckles. There was a small cafe with a chalkboard outside offering chicken corn soup, apple dumplings, and coffee refills for 75 cents. Elara paused at the cafe longer than she meant to. Through the window she saw men in suspenders bent over plates, a woman wrapping pie in waxed paper, an elderly couple sharing toast in the corner booth. The bell over the door rang as someone entered, releasing a warmth that smelled of brown butter and coffee. Elara had $3 saved and 62 cents loose in her coat pocket. She knew exactly which money could be touched and which could not. She walked on. The county annex occupied the first floor of a narrow brick building between a surveyor's office and a shop that sold postcards, jams, and hex-sign coasters for visitors. A small brass plaque beside the door read Lancaster County Records Satellite Office. Below it, in smaller letters, property transfers, deeds, tax notices, public cells. The door was heavier than it looked. It opened into a room that smelled of paper, floor polish, damp wool, and the faint, bitter ghost of old coffee. There were 3 customer chairs, a wooden counter with a worn groove where people had leaned for decades, and a wall of metal filing cabinets with label holders gone cloudy from age. On the far wall hung a framed map of the county, faded at the edges, with townships colored in gentle yellows and greens. A clock ticked above the service window. It was 8 minutes after 10. The clerk sat behind the counter beneath a fluorescent light that hummed softly. She was a square-built woman in her late 60s with silver hair pinned in a low coil, wire-rimmed glasses on a chain, and hands that looked capable of both mending a hem and stopping foolishness at its source. Her blouse was lavender, buttoned to the throat, and her cardigan had wooden buttons shaped like little leaves. On the desk in front of her sat a black nameplate with white letters. MRS. Odd line R. Kiffer. Deputy clerk. She looked at Elara's shoes first, then the backpack, then the folded notice held carefully in both hands. Her face did not soften, but it sharpened in a kinder direction. "Public sale parcel?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." Elara slid the notice across the counter. "Mrs. Kiefer lowered her glasses, read the page without touching it, then brought one finger down on the parcel number as though holding it in place. "That one." The words did not invite celebration. "Yes, ma'am." "You came alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "How old are you?" Elara gave her the state ID from the paper sleeve, removing the 3 folded dollars first and placing them under her palm. Mrs. Kiefer noticed. She noticed everything. She copied the number, typed slowly into an old computer, then rose and walked to a cabinet with a key ring at her waist, making a dry little music. While she searched, Elara looked around the office and tried not to lean on the counter too much. Her legs had begun to tremble from the walk. There was a dish of wrapped peppermints near the register, a jar of pens, a stack of deed forms weighted with a stone shaped like a sleeping cat, and beside the clerk's keyboard a photograph of 3 children in church clothes, all grown now if the fading was any measure. Mrs. Kiefer returned with a manila folder thick enough to trouble her. She set it down and tapped the cover. "You understand this is a sheriff's sale of a condemned structure?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county is not certifying habitability?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there may be liens?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand utilities are disconnected?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition costs can fall to the owner if the building remains un—" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk watched her a moment. "Do you understand what that last sentence means in plain English?" Elara swallowed. Her throat felt dry, not from fear alone, but from the miles. "It means if I cannot make it safe, I may owe more than I have." Mrs. Kiefer sat back slightly. "That is the first sensible answer I have heard about that parcel in 3 years." She opened the folder. Inside were photographs clipped to inspection reports, tax forms, notices of non-compliance, a condemnation order, and a sheet with signatures from a postponed auction where no bidder had appeared. Elara saw the shop for the first time in the photographs. A brick rectangle under leaning gutters. Boarded windows. A faded sign barely readable above the front entrance. Weeds at the sill. A chimney with one corner missing near the top. It looked worse than she had imagined. It also looked real. Mrs. Kiefer turned a page and placed a form before her. The minimum bid is $3 because the county wants the liability transferred before demolition season. There are back taxes waived by order of sale, but recording fees are suspended only because the parcel has no competing bidder and is classified as a hazard. You will still need to present payment for the bid amount. Elara lifted her palm. The $3 lay on the counter, flattened from weeks of being hidden. One bill had a torn corner. Another was soft as cloth from long circulation. The third bore a faint purple stamp from some business far from there. Mrs. Kiefer looked at the money and did not touch it for a long while. Then she opened the cash drawer. The sound seemed too ordinary for the changing of a life. A metal slide. Coins shifting in their cups. Paper lifted and placed. A receipt printed on a narrow strip with blue ink that was already fading as it emerged. "Sign here, Mrs." Kiefer said. Elara took the pen. Her hand shook only once, on the W of Whitcomb. She steadied it with her other hand and wrote the rest slowly. Elara Mae Whitcomb. The name looked older on the deed than it had ever looked on school papers. Job applications, library cards, or grocery schedules. It looked like a person who might have to answer for herself. Mrs. Kiefer turned the form, checked the signature, and took a brass stamp from the right side of her desk. It was not large, but she lifted it with ceremony. The base came down on the paper with a hard, exact sound that seemed to pass through the counter into Elara's hands. Received. Recorded. Transferred. One word under another, pressed into the page. The clerk signed below the stamp, then blotted the ink with a square of absorbent paper, though no one had required such old care for years. "Do you have a V?" "No, ma'am." Mrs. Kiefer looked up. "How did you—" "Bus partway. Walked the rest." The clerk removed her glasses. Her eyes were gray, not cold, but accustomed to seeing what people tried to place behind their backs. "From Lancaster?" Mostly is a hard distance." Elara did not answer. Mrs. Kiefer folded a photocopied map from a drawer and marked a route in pencil. Her hand moved firmly, drawing from the annex to the edge of town, then along a road that curved between farms. "You will go east on Old Philadelphia Pike for a bit. Then take Queen Road south where the walnut stand begins. You will pass a white farmhouse with a green pump out front. Do not take the first lane after that. It washes out. Take the second. The parcel sits back from the road, near an old drainage run. If you reach the covered bridge, you have gone too far." "Yes, ma'am. Front door may be nailed. Side entrance is under the lean-to." "Yes, ma'am. There is no running water." "Yes, ma'am. No heat." "Yes, ma'am. No lawful occupancy certificate." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Kiefer's mouth tightened, not with impatience, but with the effort of choosing what could still be said. "And there may be animals." "Yes, ma'am. Not pet." "Yes, "Ma'am." The clerk closed the folder, but her hand remained on it. Then she glanced again at the deed, at the signature, at the name. "Whitcomb," she said. Elara had been reaching for the map. She stopped. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk turned her chair toward the filing cabinets behind her, but she did not rise. Her gaze had moved somewhere inward, through years arranged in paper drawers. "There was a Whitcomb printer over near Strasburg," she said. "Elias Whitcomb. Did small church bulletins, sale bills, hymn sheets, wedding invitations, things people cared about more than they paid for." Elara's fingers closed around the edge of the counter. "He was my grandfather." "Mrs. Kiefer looked at her then in full. For the first time, her official face changed. Not much. A softening at the corners of the mouth. A lowering of the shoulders. The kind of recognition that does not make noise because it respects what it has found. "He printed my daughter's wedding invitations in 1984, she said. "Set every line by hand because she wanted a verse under the names and the commercial shop said it would cost extra. He said a verse for a wedding ought not be charged by the line." Elara looked down at the deed because looking at the clerk became difficult. "He was like that," she said. "He was careful, Mrs." Kiefer replied. "Careful in a way people are not much anymore." From a drawer, she took an envelope and slipped the deed copy, receipt, map, and inspection packet inside. Then, after a moment, she added a second photocopy that had not been in the folder. It showed the building from the road in 1962, not yet ruined, with all windows intact and the sign above the door legible. Wenger & Sons Letterpress. Books, broadsides, handbills. A man stood in the doorway of the photograph, blurred by age or motion, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. "This was in a local history file, Mrs." Kiefer said. "Not required for transfer. But it belongs better with you than in that drawer." Elara touched the photocopy with 2 fingers. "Thank you." The clerk took one peppermint from the dish and placed it on the envelope. Then she took another, considered it, and placed that one beside the first. "The cafe will give you water if you ask. Doris owns it. Tell her Adeline said you are walking. I do not want to trouble anyone. You are not as heavy a trouble as you think." Elara put the peppermints in her coat pocket and lifted the backpack. "Mrs." Kiefer came around the counter more slowly than Elara expected, unlocked a side drawer, and removed a narrow brass key with a paper tag darkened by time. "No guarantee it works," she said. "Keys outlive doors, and sometimes doors outlive keys." Elara accepted it. The tag read side. The clerk held the door open for her. Outside, the village had brightened with late morning. Visitors moved between shops. A horse stamped at the buggy rail. Somewhere close, a hammer struck wood in measured blows. "Miss Whitcomb, Mrs." Kiefer said. Elara turned. "Your grandfather once told me crooked type can still print straight if the form is locked with patience." Elara smiled a little, though it did not reach her whole face. "Not yet." "That sounds like him." "Then use patience." The door closed behind her with the soft suction of a weather strip. She did ask at the cafe for water. She meant only water. Doris, the owner, proved to be a woman with broad shoulders, auburn hair pinned high, and an apron dusted with flour at the hip. She listened to the message from Adeline, then filled a glass, then filled a jar, then put 2 slices of bread and a boiled egg into a paper bag without discussing money. Elara opened her mouth. Doris shook her head once. "Walk before." That was all. Elara walked. Old Philadelphia Pike carried more traffic than she liked, so she kept close to the edge. Boots scraping gravel, one hand gripping the envelope inside her coat. The land outside town opened in long, deliberate folds. Cornfields cut to stubble. Pastures darkened by rain. Farmhouses square and white under sober roofs. Here and there, laundry moved on lines like flags of domestic patience, shirts and sheets lifting together in the breeze. At Queen Road, the walnut trees began as Miss Kiefer had said. They stood on both sides of the turning, not in an orchard row but scattered, older than the fences around them, their trunks dark and ridged, their leaves already yellowing at the edges. Black walnuts lay in the grass and along the road shoulder, green husks bruised brown where wagon wheels and tires had passed over them. The smell was sharp, bitter, and clean, like ink mixed with earth. She passed the white farmhouse with the green pump. A little boy in a straw hat watched her from the porch, one hand on the rail. A woman behind him looked up from snapping beans into a bowl but did not wave. Farther along, an old black dog rose from the shade near a mailbox and barked once. Not fiercely, only as a matter of record. When Elara kept walking, the dog lowered itself again and laid its chin on its paws. The first lane after the farmhouse was little more than 2 ruts dropping through weeds toward a shallow wash. Water still shone there from the previous rain. She passed it and took the second lane, where Queen Road bent and the fields gave way to a neglected strip of trees, sumac, and wild grape. The lane had not been graded in years. Grass grew high between the tracks. Brambles caught the hem of her coat. The backpack shifted against her spine with each step. Then the shop appeared. It did not rise so much as emerge, red brick darkened by weather, half hidden behind walnut limbs and the gray stems of weeds. The building was longer than she had expected, about 38 feet from front to back and 22 across, with a low gabled roof sagging near the rear slope. The bricks had been laid in common bond, 5 stretcher courses between headers, the mortar pale where it remained and hollowed where water had worried it out. A single chimney stood on the west side, missing several courses at the crown. The front faced the lane. 2 windows were boarded. A third had no glass, only a jagged lower sash and a curtain of spiderweb moving in the air. Above the door hung the old sign from the photocopy, though time had taken most of its paint. Wenger and Son, Letterpress. The rest had blurred into gray boards and nail shadows. A lean-to clung to the right side, its roof lower and patched with rusted tin. Beneath it stood a side door swollen by years of damp, cross-braced with old planks. The ground near the sill dipped toward the building, which explained the green-black stain along the lower bricks. Wild asters grew there anyway, pale purple against rot. Elara stopped 10 feet from the entrance. She had seen ruined places before from bus windows and sidewalks, but ruins at a distance belonged to weather. This one had her name on a deed. That changed the air around it. She became aware of every sound. A crow in the walnut tree. A loose piece of tin tapping somewhere with the breeze. Water dripping inside, though it had not rained since morning. Her own breath, shallow from the walk. She took out the brass key. It did not work at first. The lock resisted with the dignity of a thing long unused. She worked the key in and out carefully, remembering Elias's rule. Never force a drawer. Never force what age has made stubborn. She blew into the keyhole, though she knew that was foolish, then wrapped the key in the edge of her sleeve for better grip and turned again. The lock gave. Not cleanly. Not generously. It surrendered with a scrape that traveled down the door and into the frame. She pushed. The side door opened 3 inches and stopped against something on the inside. She leaned her shoulder into it. Wood groaned. Something dragged across the floor. The gap widened enough for one person. Cold air breathed out, carrying the dense smell of dust, mouse droppings, damp plaster, old paper, and a fainter scent beneath all of it. Ink. Not fresh. Not even strong. But present, held somewhere in the grain of the place. Elara slipped inside. The first room was dim, its boarded windows admitting thin blades of light through cracks between planks. Dust hung in those lines, turning slowly. The floor under her feet was wide plank, cupped with age and dark near the walls. A counter ran along the front, its surface scarred by knives, bottles, and perhaps 100 elbows. Behind it stood shelves, mostly empty, though a few bundles of yellowed paper remained tied with cotton string. The ceiling was low enough to make the room feel held down. Plaster had fallen in 2 corners, exposing lath-like ribs. Near the front door, a metal bell lay on the floor beside a broken bracket. When she touched it with her toe, it gave no sound. She set down the backpack and stood listening. The building settled around her. A tick from the roof. A skitter inside one wall. A slow drip in the back room. Wind entering somewhere it should not. None of it was welcoming. None of it was cruel. She crossed to the front windows and looked through a gap in the boards. The lane lay empty. Walnut branches moved beyond it with the slow authority of trees that had watched owners come and go. No one had followed. No one called her name. No one knew to object. She returned to the side door, pulled the backpack inside, and eased the door shut as far as the warped frame allowed. A strip of light remained at the bottom. The back room was larger and colder. Here the shop still held its bones. Against one wall stood a stone sink, dry and stained, with no faucet handle. Beside it, racks for paper leaned at angles. Some shelves collapsed. A work table occupied the middle of the room. Heavy oak, one leg repaired with an iron strap. Its surface was gray with dust except where roof water had fallen and made dark circles in the wood. On the far wall, under a tarp gone stiff with age, stood the shape of a press. Elara did not uncover it yet. She was too hungry for reverence and too tired for discovery. Instead, she checked the floor for holes, found a corner of the front room where the roof seemed to leak least, and cleared it with a scrap of board. Mouse pellets, plaster chips, dead leaves, a page from something printed long ago, its ink too blurred to read. She swept with her hands because there was no broom, pushing debris into a little pile near the wall. From the cafe bag she took the bread and boiled egg. She ate slowly, sitting on the floor with her back against the counter. The first bite of bread nearly undid her, not because it was fine bread, though it was, but because someone had put it in a bag without asking her to earn it. She saved half for morning. The light failed early inside the boarded shop. By late afternoon the room had become a study in grays. She explored only what she had to. There was an outhouse behind the building, leaning but usable if entered carefully. There was a rusted hand pump near the walnut tree, but its handle moved without drawing water. There was a back step cracked down the middle, and a patch of ground beyond it where weeds hid broken bottles, printer scrap, and a length of chain. She found no electricity, no stove fit to light, no clean blanket, no reason to believe the night would be kinder than the barn. Still, when darkness came, she was inside walls. She put on the sweater and winter coat, tucked the deed envelope beneath the apron inside her backpack, and lay down on the front room floor with her head on the rolled coat. The boards were hard, but they were not a bus station chair. The darkness was deep, but not fluorescent. Rain began sometime after she lay down. A light rain at first, then steadier, finding every weakness in the roof. Drops fell into buckets that were not there. One struck the floor near her shoulder every 8 or 9 seconds. Another fell somewhere in the back room with a hollow tap, as if landing inside an old can. Water moved down the walls in places she could not see. The smell of damp plaster thickened. Elara pulled the coat closer. Her feet ached with a pulse of their own. The blister on her heel had opened. Her stomach made small. Practical complaints. Somewhere in the wall, mice resumed their night work. Quick and secretive. She did not cry. That would have required a kind of looseness she did not possess then. Instead, she listened. The shop had sounds enough for listening. Rain on tin. Rain on shingles. Rain finding paper. A board answering the wind. A loose nail ticking. The long, low breath of a building that had been shut away from human care and was not yet certain what to do with company. In the dark, she reached from the coat and laid one hand flat on the floor. The plank was cold, rough where grain had risen, and faintly uneven beneath her palm. A floor made by someone. A floor worn by someone. A floor that had held the weight of cases, presses, paper, men in aprons, women with orders, children waiting at the counter, rain boots, grief shoes, Sunday shoes, work shoes. She left her hand there until it warmed a small place in the wood. The shop was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning did not enter the shop so much as gather there, thin and gray, collecting along the cracks in the boards over the windows. Elara woke before full light, because the floor had allowed only short pieces of sleep and because cold had a way of touching every joint separately. For a while she remained under the coat, listening to the rain diminish from steady tapping to occasional drops. Somewhere in the back room, water fell into water. Somewhere under the counter, a mouse worried at paper. She sat up slowly. The first business of ownership was not dreaming. It was locating a dry corner, a place to relieve herself without shame, and water she could trust. She ate the saved bread in 3 careful bites and put the boiled eggshell from the night before into her coat pocket because she did not yet know where refuse belonged. Then she took the deed envelope from beneath the apron and checked that it was still dry. It was. The paper had curled slightly from the damp air, but the stamp transfer remained legible. On that first day, she learned the building by necessity. The outhouse stood 15 paces behind the lean-to, tilted toward a patch of sumac as if exhausted by its own purpose. The door hung from one hinge, and the crescent moon cutout was half blocked by a wasp nest gone papery and dead. She entered with a board in hand, not knowing whether raccoons, snakes, or worse had claimed it. Nothing moved but a spider on the sill. The seat was cracked but held. That was enough. The hand pump near the walnut tree was more stubborn. It rose from a square of broken concrete, painted green once, now mostly rust with flakes of color left in sheltered places. Elara worked the handle up and down until her palm hurt. The pipe gave a dry metallic cough, then nothing. She found an old coffee can near the back step, filled it with rainwater from a barrel under the lean-to, and poured it into the pump throat because somewhere, from some remembered summer with Elias, she knew a pump sometimes needed priming. She pumped again. The handle resisted, caught, then moved with a deeper pull. Brown water spat from the spout, stopped, then came in a thin stream carrying grit, rust, and the smell of deep iron. She let it run until her arm trembled. It never became clear, but it became less brown. She filled the jar Doris had given her, set it on the back step to settle, and marked the pump in her mind as not yet safe for drinking. By noon she understood the floors better than the walls. The front room had 4 voices underfoot. Near the counter, the planks answered with a soft complaint but held firm. Near the boarded windows, the boards dipped and had to be crossed along the joists. The threshold to the back room groaned in a lower tone, like a chest clearing itself. In the southwest corner, where rain had worked through for years, the floor gave a hollow warning she respected. She began to walk the shop as one might learn the manners of a housebound elder. Not too quickly. Not in the same careless line twice. Weight first on the ball of the foot, then the heel, hand ready for the wall. Eyes lowered, not from defeat, but attention. The second day brought sun and more trouble. Light exposed what darkness had been merciful enough to hide. Mildew and fans across the plaster. A bird skeleton under the front counter, delicate and almost weightless. A wasp nest tucked inside an upper shelf. Mice trails through paper dust. The press under the tarp larger than she had guessed, its iron body waiting with a dark patience that made her look away for reasons she could not name. She found a broom in the lean-to, or what remained of one, its straw shortened and mouse-chewed, its handle sound enough for use if held near the middle. She swept the front room in narrow sections, stopping often to rest, because dust rose quickly and made her throat close. She tied the scarf over her nose. She opened the side door. She propped it with a brick. The shop exhaled. On the third day, hunger drove her farther than fear. The loose change in her pocket was nearly gone, and the water situation had become too uncertain for pride. She walked back toward town under a high, clean sky, following the lane past the dog, the green pump, the walnut stand, and the open fields. Her heel had scabbed badly. Each step pulled at it. She ignored the pain until ignoring became its own labor. The hardware store sat a little beyond the cafe, in a brick building with a green awning and a front window filled with rakes, lanterns, seed packets, mouse traps, and a pyramid of galvanized buckets. The sign read Hirschberger Hardware in black paint, hand-shadowed with gold that had faded to mustard. A bell rang when she entered, and the smell of the place met her with such force that she stopped just inside the door. Oil, rope, sawdust, kerosene, cardboard, iron, beeswax, fertilizer, coffee in a mug somewhere behind the counter. It was the smell of usefulness arranged in aisles. A man came from the back carrying a crate of stovepipe elbows. He was tall but stooped through the shoulders, with a white beard trimmed close, ears reddened by cold, and one milky eye that wandered slightly while the other took in everything with calm precision. He wore a canvas apron over a plaid shirt, and a pencil rested behind his left ear, sharpened to a needlepoint. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He set the crate down with a soft grunt. "You are the Whitcomb girl with Wenger's place." It was not a question. News traveled on roads she had only just learned. "Yes, sir. Name's Amos Hirschberger. Elara. I know." He said it without embarrassment, as if names, like nails and hinges, belonged where they could be found. She walked the aisles slowly, trying not to look desperate in front of shelves full of things she needed. Tar paper, roofing nails, caulk, kerosene, rags, work gloves, twine, a handsaw, a galvanized pail, mouse tins, stove cement, a scrub brush, a box of matches. A roll of plastic. Her mind listed each item and then crossed it away because money did not allow imagination. Amos watched from behind the counter while polishing a brass hose nozzle with a rag. Finally, he said, "What do you need first?" "Water, heat, and a roof," she answered. He nodded once. "That is 3 first." "I know. Which can kill you fastest?" She considered. "Bad chimney." He came around the counter and led her to a shelf near the back, where chimney brushes hung by wire loops beside rods in 4-foot sections. Then he stopped and looked toward her shoes, her coat, the backpack strap repaired with clear tape, and the envelope held under one arm. "You have money today?" She took out the coins. Not the $3, because those were gone. Not bills, because there were none. 62 cents in mixed change lay in her palm. Amos looked at the coins. Then he looked at her face. "I am going to open a credit account. I cannot promise when I can pay. I did not ask when. I do not want charity." "Neither do I," he said. "Charity makes fools of people when it is done careless. Credit makes a record." He went behind the counter, pulled a ledger from beneath the register, and opened to a clean line. The pages were ruled in blue and red, names written in patient columns. "What is the account?" She hesitated. "Wenger Place," he said, writing already. "Care of Elara Whitcomb. I may fail. That goes in a different—" She looked at him, unsure whether he had meant to be kind. His expression gave nothing away. He placed a thin paperback on the counter. The cover showed a drawing of a farmhouse roof, a brick chimney, and a smiling man in a cap who looked too cheerful to be trusted. Home Repair Ferrero Constructors.
1976 edition.
"The illustrations are plain," Amos said. "Advice is mostly sound if you ignore the section on aluminum wiring. Do not ignore the safety notes. Some people do. Then widows come in for furnace pipe. How much is it? Free with account. I thought credit makes a record. It does. I wrote book. No charge." He began setting items on the counter with a deliberateness that gave each object dignity. 1 6-inch square wire chimney brush, used but serviceable, $2.25 on account. 6 fiberglass rods, $1 each on account. Cotton work gloves, 79 cents. A small tin of stove black, not needed yet, moved aside. A box of safety matches, 19 cents. 1 galvanized bucket, $1.10. A stiff scrub brush, 45 cents. 2 cakes of yellow laundry soap, 20 cents apiece. A packet of cheesecloth for straining pump water, 12 cents. 1 pound of cut nails, marked down because the box had split, 88 cents. A 5x7 canvas tarp from the back room, patched but dry, $3. A coil of cotton sash cord, not for now but useful, $1.30. A second-hand claw hammer with a hickory handle dark from another person's grip, 75 cents. The numbers entered the ledger one by one. When he reached the end, the total stood at $17.73. Elara looked at it for a long moment. "I have never owed a store before. Most buildings start by owing somebody." He tore a sheet from a small pad and wrote 3 lines in block letters. "Do not light chimney until clean. Open flue before test fire. Keep water near." Then he added below it, "Come back if smoke enters room." He slid the note into the repair manual and tied the rods together with twine. At the door, he stopped her. "That chimney has been cold a long time. Birds like cold chimneys. So do squirrels. Creosote can glaze like black glass. You scrape until brick shows. Not until you are tired. Yes, sir. Do you have a hat? She shook her head. He took a brown knit cap from a hook behind the counter and placed it on top of the bundle. Lost and found, he said. There was no basket labeled lost and found. She carried the supplies back in 2 trips, because pride could not change the weight of rods and bucket and tarp. The first load rode awkwardly over one shoulder, and by the time she reached Queen Road, her arms shook. The second load came near dusk, the sky already turning rose behind the barns. The black dog followed her for 30 yards, then lost interest. On the 4th morning inside the shop, she began the chimney. She did not do it bravely. She did it carefully, which was better. First she cleared the hearth area in the back room. It was not a fireplace, exactly, but a small brick chimney breast with a thimble opening where a stovepipe had once entered. The stove itself was gone, leaving only a square stain on the floor and 4 shallow dents where its legs had rested. The clean-out door sat near the base, rusted but present. Above it, mortar had powdered along the joints, and the bricks were scaled in places from old damp. She spread the tarp across the floor, weighted the corners with bricks, and tied the scarf around her hair. She put on the knit cap over it and the cotton gloves, though they were thin and soon blackened. Then she opened the clean-out door with the claw of the hammer. Soot fell at once. Not a little. A black, soft collapse that poured onto the tarp like earth from a grave. She stepped back, coughed into the scarf, and waited for the air to settle. The smell was bitter, oily, and old enough to seem almost animal. Creosote clung to the inside surfaces in ridges, some flaky, some shiny and hard. Amos had been right. In places it had glazed like black glass. From outside, she inspected the chimney as far as she could from the ground. The missing crown stones worried her, but the flue seemed open at the top. She did not have a ladder high enough to work from above, so she chose the slower method from below, feeding rods upward through the thimble opening section by section. The brush resisted immediately. She pushed, twisted clockwise, drew it down, pushed again. Soot rained into the bucket she had set beneath the opening, though much mist and spread across her sleeves. The first 4 feet took nearly an hour. Her shoulders burned, her throat roughened. Twice she stepped outside and breathed beside the walnut tree until the cold air steadied her. Then back inside. Push, twist, draw. Knock the rod against the bucket. Add another section. Push again. At 6 feet, she struck a blockage. Not solid brick. Not a flue collapse. Something springy and packed. She worked the brush up and down until twigs began falling. Then straw. Then a gray bundle of feathers, dust, and mouse-chewed material that had once been a nest. She used the hammer handle to draw it out through the clean-out, piece by piece, gagging at the smell. Behind the nest came more soot, harder this time, breaking loose in scales. Some pieces were dull and crumbly. Others had the sheen of coal. She remembered Amos's line, "Scrape until brick shows. Not until you are tired." She was tired long before brick showed. By noon her arms trembled so badly she could not hold the rod straight. She drank pump water strained through cheesecloth and boiled in the coffee can over a fire of twigs outside, though the taste remained metallic. She ate nothing because there was nothing ready to eat. Then she returned to the chimney. The work took 7 hours the first day and 3 the next morning. She scraped the lower flue with a wire brush until the brick appeared in patches beneath the black. She emptied the soot into a pit behind the outhouse, standing upwind as best she could. She wiped the clean-out door, checked the flue with a shard of mirror angled toward daylight, and left the chimney open to air until evening. For the test fire, she used almost nothing. 3 twists of newspaper found under the counter. A handful of dry twigs from beneath the lean-to. 2 narrow pieces of scrap wood no thicker than her thumb. The galvanized bucket stood full beside her, as Amos had ordered. She opened the flue, though the handle barely moved, and held a lit match near the thimble. The flame bent inward. Draft. She set the newspaper alight. Smoke rose, hesitated, then drew upward into the chimney. Not all of it. A thin blue strand entered the room first, enough to make her tense, but then the draft strengthened and took the smoke cleanly. The twigs caught. The scrap wood followed. A small, cautious fire lived where there had been only cold brick. Elara crouched before it with both hands extended. Warmth touched her palms, then her wrists, then her face. The heat was modest, uneven, and entirely sufficient. After weeks of borrowed chairs, bus shelters, damp cardboard, and hard floors, the little fire seemed almost too intimate. It asked nothing except tending. She made her first hot meal in the shop from what Doris had tucked into a second paper bag when Elara passed the cafe for water. A potato, an onion, and a heel of ham wrapped in butcher paper. In the coffee can, after washing it 3 times with boiled water and soap, she simmered the potato and onion with a pinch of salt Amos had given her in a folded packet. The ham went in at the end, just long enough to lend it smoke. She ate sitting on the tarp, the can wrapped in a rag, steam rising into her face. No table had ever held a finer supper. After the chimney came inventory. Not because the place was safe. It was not. Not because she knew what she possessed. She did not. But order, even a narrow order, gave the days a spine. She began with the front room. The counter measured 12 feet long, oak under grime, with 2 drawers on the customer side and 6 behind. Drawer 1 held curled receipts, several blank order forms, and a cracked inkwell. Drawer 2 held string, wax paper, a rusted pair of scissors, and mouse bedding made from an old calendar. Behind the counter she found 3 shelves of paper remnants, cream bond, laid stationery, blue rag paper foxed at the edges, and a stack of envelopes sealed together by damp. In a cigar box were brass clips, 2 pencil stubs, a button hook, and a church key for opening bottles. In another, a handful of calling cards printed for people long gone from the county. Miss Anna B. Stout. Reverend Jonas K. Miller. H. Wenger. Printer. Their names felt less discarded than paused. The back room required longer attention. She uncovered the press first. The tarp came away in flakes of dust. Beneath it stood a Chandler & Price platen press, black iron dulled but not ruined, flywheel still, treadle intact though the leather belt had split. She did not touch the moving parts beyond laying her hand on the side casting. The cold iron held the room's temperature and something more severe, a weighting density. On the nameplate, the raised letters remained legible. Sea level and Ohio. Near the press stood a smaller tabletop press with a broken roller hook, 2 composing stones, 1 cracked, and a galley rack with 6 trays still in place. The trays held nothing but dust and a single dead moth. Along the north wall were type cases, stacked in 2 slanted cabinets and 1 freestanding iron-type cabinet so heavy-looking that the floor beneath it had sunk slightly. The wooden cases in the slanted cabinets had labels written in ink, 10 Pt. Caslon, 12 Pt. Garamond, 18 PT Clarendon. Borders. Ornaments. Spaces and quads. Many drawers were empty. Some held pied type, letters mixed by careless hands or time. Some were still orderly enough to make her breath catch. She pulled one drawer only halfway and stopped when it protested. The rule returned. Never force a drawer. The work table held a composing stick, not Elias's, but a similar one, wrapped in an oilcloth stiff with age. Beside it lay a pica ruler, a bundle of coins, a planer, a mallet with a split head, 2 brayers hard as stone, a dried bottle of red ink, and a stack of tympan sheets gone brittle at the corners. On hooks above the sink hung an awl, a bone folder, a bookbinder's needle packet, and 3 lengths of linen thread so dry they broke when touched. Beneath the sink she found a crock of paste turned to powder, a coil of rusted wire, and a mouse nest made partly from marbled paper. She wrote everything down in the margins of the repair manual. Not values. Not hopes. Objects. Press. Large. Press. Small. Type cabinet. Iron. Type cases. 2. Paper rack. Work table. Hand tools. Binding tools. Water damage east wall. Roof leak above rack. Chimney cleaned. Pump questionable. Outhouse usable. Front door nailed. Side door key works. Method made fear stand at a slight distance. On the 6th day, she began testing the type drawers. The iron cabinet troubled her from the first. It was taller than her shoulder and broad as a wardrobe, with 30 narrow drawers and iron cup holes gone smooth from use. The cabinet stood against the west wall, not far from the chimney breast but not touching it. At first glance it seemed like any type cabinet, though heavier, perhaps from the cast iron frame. Its paint had gone from black to a dark green in places, and rust bloomed near the base where damp had climbed. She pulled the top drawer. It moved with effort but came free enough to show spaces and quads. The second held a battered serif face in 12-point. The third was empty except for dust. Drawer after drawer gave ordinary findings. Mixed letters. Broken leads. A dead beetle. A strip of printed paper used as a shim. Yet something about the cabinet was wrong. On the 7th drawer from the bottom, when she pushed it closed, the sound differed. Not the wooden stop of a drawer meeting its back rail. A duller sound. Deeper. As if the cabinet had another depth behind the drawer that it did not admit. She stood still. Then she opened the drawer and removed it completely. It was heavier than expected but manageable if held from beneath. Behind it, instead of the cabinet back she expected, she saw wood dark with dust. She tapped it with the handle of the hammer. Flat. Solid. She tapped the side wall of the opening. Higher note. She tapped the back again. Dull. She removed the drawer above it and then the drawer below. Both backs sounded ordinary. Thin and immediate. Wood against wall. The 7th space held depth. Hidden depth. For an hour she did nothing more dramatic than test. She tapped from inside the empty drawer cavity. She tapped the exterior back of the cabinet, though reaching it required moving stacks of warped paper and squeezing behind the frame. She pressed her shoulder against one side, then the other. The cabinet did not move. She tried to rock it, gently at first, then harder. It answered with a weight beyond type. At the lower right corner of the suspicious cavity, beneath a clot of dust, her finger found a round plug. Cedar, not oak. A disc no wider than a nickel. set flush into the panel and darkened to nearly the same color as the surrounding wood. It had no slot, no handle, no obvious purpose. When she rubbed it with the edge of her sleeve, a faint line appeared across the grain. Not decoration, a cover. She fetched the awl from the binding hooks and worked its point carefully along the seam. The cedar disc shifted, but did not come free. She paused, breathed through her nose, and took the bone folder instead because metal might scar whatever mechanism remained. The folder's tip entered the seam. The disc lifted slightly. She caught it with her fingernail and drew it out. Behind it was a narrow iron pin, black with age. She pulled. Nothing. She turned. Nothing. She pushed inward. Somewhere behind the panel, a latch dropped with a small, exact click. Elara stepped back so quickly her shoulder struck the work table. The panel did not spring open. It remained as it was, patient and secretive. She returned to it with both hands and pressed along the left edge. This time the false back shifted inward a fraction, then swung toward her on hidden hinges so stiff they barely remembered their work. Cold air came from the cavity. Not a draft. Not cellar air. Simply the cold of a place sealed away from weather and touch. Inside the hidden compartment were 3 packages wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cotton tape gone brown, and behind them a rectangular metal box painted dull gray. The box had a handle folded flat into its lid and a brass plate stamped with the words Senchi Fire Safe. Its corners were worn, but the lock had been left unlatched. On top of it lay a piece of cedar, perhaps to keep insects away, and a folded square of muslin. Elara did not remove anything at first. She sat down on the floor in front of the cabinet and waited until the trembling in her hands lessened. The room seemed to have drawn closer around her. The press, the work table, the broken rollers, the paper racks, all of it present without sound. Dust moved in the light from the open side door. Outside, a crow called once from the walnut tree and was answered from farther off. She reached for the first oilcloth package. The knot resisted, and she would not cut it. She worked the cotton tape loose thread by thread. Inside was a set of binding tools wrapped in flannel, a bone folder smoother and finer than the one on the wall, 2 awls with polished handles, a sewing frame clamp, a lifting knife, a brass-edged ruler, and a pair of shears so well balanced that when she opened them, they made a clean, intimate sound. The second package held raw material. Sheets of marbled end paper in blues, umbers, and smoky reds. Linen thread wound on wooden spools. 3 packets of gold leaf sealed in glassine. A roll of bookcloth the color of deep moss. Several strips of calfskin wrapped around a cedar core. A note in a handwriting she did not know said dry storages only in faded brown ink. The third package held printing tools, a composing stick newer than the one on the table, 2 coins wrapped in paper, a small font of ornaments with leaves and acorns, and a chase for the tabletop press. Beneath these lay a tin box decorated once with painted roses, now scratched and dull. The tin box opened with a soft pop. Inside were family things, though she did not yet know whose family. A lock of pale hair tied with black thread. 3 tintypes, their surfaces dark until angled toward the light. A child's slate pencil. A wedding ring wrapped in tissue. A church bulletin printed for a funeral in 1919. A medal on a faded ribbon, bronze darkened almost brown, with a profile at the center and the year 1918 stamped near the lower edge. She held it in her palm and felt its weight without understanding its history. Only then did she draw the fire-safe box from the compartment. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor and opened the lid. The first thing she saw was paper. Not papers in disorder, bundles, bank-wrapped currency in aged sleeves, some brittle at the edges, some tied with cotton string. Beneath them were envelopes, a cloth pouch, and a flat packet wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax that had cracked but not broken. On top lay a handwritten sheet folded once, with no envelope. She did not read it. Not yet. Hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion had made her practical. But this was different. This required a steadier self than the one crouched in soot-blackened gloves before a hidden box. She counted the money first because numbers could be handled. The bills were old, but not ancient. Tens, 20s, 50s, and hundreds from different years, some silver certificates, some Federal Reserve notes, all kept flat. She made stacks on the tarp, smoothing each bill with the side of her hand. Once she began, she did not stop, because stopping would allow meaning to enter too soon. 1,000, 5, 10, 20. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. She counted twice, then a third time, writing each stack in the repair manual with the pencil Amos had given her. The cash came to $48,000 exactly in paper currency. In the cloth pouch were coins, 2 Morgan silver dollars, 1 peace dollar, 7 mercury dimes, 4 buffalo nickels, 6 wheat pennies, and a $half worn nearly smooth. The odd coins added 37 cents by face value, though she knew some might be worth more to collectors. $48,037. She looked at the number until the pencil mark blurred. It did not become a mansion, or a car, or a new coat, or a return to school in some triumphant parade. It became shingles, mortar, food through winter, a doctor if fever came, a legal consultation perhaps, though she dismissed that as soon as it appeared. She would not turn her life backward toward Martin. She would not spend what had been kept in silence on a fight that would require his name in her mouth. The money meant time. That was larger than wealth. At the bottom of the box, beneath the currency in the sealed packet, lay a bundle of pages tied with blue thread. The first page showed a title written in a careful, slanted hand. Poems for the Shilled Wool Comb. Below it, in smaller letters, E. W. Elara touched the initials but did not untie the thread. The handwriting was not Elias's, yet the first letter struck her with such force that she closed the lid halfway, then opened it again to be sure it remained. There were other papers, too. A deed copy much older than hers, a family register, a folded map of the property showing a cottage, shop, well, walnut, drainage run, and a mark near the west wall. On the handwritten sheet she had not read, a single line showed through the fold because age had thinned the paper. My dear one, whoever you are. Elara put the sheet back. She could not read it in that room at that hour. Not with the money counted and the fire safe open and the air full of dust. Not with her body still living as if each meal had to be defended. Some inheritances arrive too large to enter all at once. They must wait at the threshold while the person inside learns to stand. She placed the bills back in the box, stack by stack. She returned the coin pouch, the medal, the poems, the sealed packet, and the folded letter. She closed the lid but did not latch it. Then she sat with her back against the iron-type cabinet until the light moved off the floor. Evening came gently. She carried the box to the front room and set it beneath the counter, wrapped in the tarp. Then, fearing damp, she moved it again to the work table. Then, fearing the windows, She moved it a third time to the space beside where she slept. Finally, she understood there would be no perfect safety, only nearness. She laid the apron over it and placed the brass ruler on top, as if a ruler could keep watch. She did not light a fire. The day had emptied her. Instead, she went outside. Behind the shop, the land fell slightly toward the drainage run, where rainwater had gathered into a narrow stream moving through grass, leaves, and silt. It was not much water, only a shallow course that would likely dry in summer, but that evening it carried the last light in broken pieces. Walnut branches leaned above it. The sky beyond the fields had turned the pale copper color that sometimes comes after clear October days, before the cold drops in earnest. Elara stood with her arms folded inside her coat and watched the water move. It slipped around stones, carried a yellow leaf, paused in a hollow, then freed itself and went on. It did not hurry. It did not explain where it had been. The land received it without announcement. In the distance, a buggy passed on Queen Road, the horse's hooves softened by damp earth. A dog barked once. From the shop behind her came no sound except the small settling of boards as the temperature fell. The hidden compartment stood open. The letter waited unread. The money waited counted and unspent. The old tools waited in their loosened wrappings. She remained outside until the cold reached through the coat and found her shoulders. Then she went back in, closed the side door, and lay down beside the fire safe with one hand resting on the lid. The shop was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning came clear enough to show every place where the night had failed to mend the world. The shop was cold, but not as cold as the barn had been. That difference mattered. Elara woke on the floor with one hand still resting on the fire-safe lid and the brass ruler lying across the apron above it. Her fingers were stiff. A line from the floor plank had pressed itself along her cheek. Outside, a blue jay scolded from the walnut tree, and the light entering through the boarded windows had a sharper edge than on rainy days. She sat up, folded the coat, and listened. The hidden compartment remained open in the iron cabinet across the back room, a dark rectangle where there had been only wood. The packages lay on the work table, tied cloth loosened but not thrown aside. She had placed the tools in rows before sleeping, not because order was needed then, but because disorder would have made the morning harder. The folded letter waited on top of the fire safe. In daylight, the handwriting became more particular. It was slanted right, with long lower loops and a capital M that rose higher than the other letters, then descended carefully, as if the writer had been trained when penmanship still carried moral weight. The ink had browned toward sepia. Along one crease, the paper had thinned until the fibers showed. The page smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and something dry that might once have been lavender. Elara washed her hands before touching it. There was no basin suitable for washing, so she poured strained water from the jar into her palms outside the back door and rubbed them with the yellow soap until the cold made her breath catch. She dried them on the inside of her coat because the towel was too dirty and because some kinds of paper deserve whatever cleanliness a person can offer. Then she came back in, sat at the work table, and unfolded the letter along its original creases. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this, then the cabinet kept its counsel longer than I could keep mine. That is as it should be. Iron is better at silence than a human heart. My name is Miriam Wenger Albright, born Miriam Elizabeth Wenger in this county on the 6th day of April, 1894, daughter of Jonas Wenger and Clara Reist Wenger, granddaughter of Matthias Wenger, who came as a boy from Germantown after the fever year of 1863, and great-granddaughter of Abraham Wenger, born near Basel in 1818 and brought over the water in his mother's arms. Abraham was a binder before he was a farmer, though the farm fed him better. Matthias printed sale bills in German and English out of a wagon before he had a shop. Jonas built this room in 1901 with his brothers, and I was given the low drawers for sorting spaces before I was tall enough to reach the counter. I am writing from a rented room near Lancaster General Hospital, where Dr. Harold B. Sensenig has told me, with more kindness than hope, that the growth in my lung has traveled beyond the place where a knife can help it. I do not write this to invite sorrow. Sorrow knows its own roads. I write because a trade can die in a room full of tools if no hand is called toward it. Our shop closed its doors on Thursday, October 10, 1957. I remember the date because the last job was a funeral card for a baby boy from bird in hand, and I could not bring myself to sweep the floor afterward. The world had already begun to ask for cheaper, faster, brighter things. Offset presses came in. Phone calls replaced notices. Men who once waited for handbills wanted them yesterday. My husband, Paul Albright, had died 12 years earlier of the fever he carried home from serving in France during the Great War. My brother Samuel did not come back from the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. My son Daniel, my only child, wore the uniform in the Second War and was lost in the Ardennes in January of 1945. After that, I had enough strength to finish orders, but not enough to persuade the world to stay. I kept working 30 years more in small ways. Mending hymnals, sewing signatures, printing labels for preserves, setting birth announcements for women whose mothers had once stood at this same counter. People called it old-fashioned. I did not mind. Old things are not holy because they are old. They become holy when human care has passed through them many times and left a path. If you mean to print here, begin with the room, not the press. Keep paper dry and raised from the floor. In winter, warm the ink slowly near the stove, never on it. Black ink takes best between 68 and 72 degrees, with the rollers warmed by movement rather than flame. For wheat paste, use 1 part flour to 4 parts water, stirred smooth before heat, cooked 8 minutes after thickening, then cooled under a cloth so no skin forms. For book glue, rabbit skin size must be soaked overnight, then warmed in a double pot, never boiled. Linen thread should be drawn once across beeswax and no more. Too much wax makes a proud seam. For paste paper, use alum lightly. For leather, dampen only the flesh side and wait until the shine leaves before turning in. Patience is not delay. Patience is the part of the work that keeps haste from ruining what love began. There is money here, though money is the least living thing in this box. Use it for shelter, heat, bread, medicine, taxes, and the repairs that keep rain from the tools. Do not let it make you grand. Grandness is a drafty room. Make yourself steady instead. If there is more than you require, leave more than you took. There are poems also. Some were written for my son. Some for the daughter I never had. Some for the child who might come by blood, and some for the one who might come by hunger, accident, or mercy. I learned that inheritance is not always a straight line. Sometimes it is a lamp left in a window long after the person who lit it has gone to bed. If you are kin, then welcome. If you are not kin, welcome all the same. Kinship has more doors than the courthouse records admit. Behind the shop, the old walnut bears a horseshoe grown halfway into its north side. Under it, Paul buried the first broken chase we could not repair. I used to stand there when I could not decide whether to keep going. I recommend standing there first before deciding anything final. Trees are better counsel than fear. Forgive the dust. Forgive the disorder. I was weaker at the end than I wished to be, and still vain enough to hope some future hand would understand that I meant to return and set things right. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Elizabeth Wenger Albright. October 3, 1958. Elara did not move when she reached the signature. The room continued with its morning sounds. A drip from somewhere near the paper rack. A wing beat in the eaves. The small scratch of a mouse behind the counter. Yet those sounds seemed to occur beyond a pane of glass. The letter lay open under her hands, and the name at the bottom held the page in place more firmly than any paperweight. She read it again. The second reading was slower, not because the words were difficult, but because they had begun to enter the room differently. Abraham, Matthias, Jonas, Miriam, Paul, Samuel, Daniel, a line of names printed not in a Bible but in the pressure between labor and loss. The shop around her ceased being merely a condemned parcel, then ceased even being a shop. It became a kept question, a place where people had stood with ink on their fingers and grief in their pockets, continuing because the next order, the next hymn sheet, the next repaired spine still asked to be done with care. When she finished the second reading, she folded the paper only along the creases already made. No new fold. That seemed important. She placed it back on the table and rested both palms beside it, not touching the ink. Her hands looked different there. Red from cold, nails rimmed with soot, small cuts along the knuckles from the chimney rods. They did not look like hands prepared for inheritance. They looked like hands that had carried too much, badly, and slept on floors. Perhaps that was why the letter had found them. She stood, took the folded map from the fire safe, and went out the back door. The morning had brightened over the fields. Frost remained in the shaded grass, but sunlight had reached the upper walnut branches, turning the yellow leaves nearly translucent. Behind the shop, the drainage run moved quietly from the last rain. Weeds leaned under beads of water. The outhouse cast a narrow shadow toward the sumac. The air smelled of damp brick, walnut husk, and wood smoke from some distant farmhouse. She found the horseshoe on the north side of the walnut. It had not been easy to see from the shop because the tree had grown around it until iron and bark had become a single weathered surface. Only the curved lower edge showed clearly, dark against ridged wood, with one nailhead visible like a small blind eye. The rest was swallowed by years. Moss had gathered in the crevice where iron met trunk. A strand of wild grapevine crossed above it and disappeared into the branches. Elara stood before it. The walnut was massive, older than the shop perhaps. Certainly older than the last person who had touched the horseshoe while it was still fully visible. Its bark held valleys deep enough to shade a fingertip. At its roots, black walnuts lay split and staining the ground. The smell rose bitter and strong when she stepped near them. Under it, Miriam had stood when she did not know whether to keep going. Under it, Paul had buried a broken chase. Under it, years had passed without asking permission. Elara placed her hand flat against the trunk below the iron curve. The bark was cold and rough, and the tree did not respond, which was one of the reasons trees could be trusted. They did not rush to comfort. They simply remained, and remaining was sometimes the largest kindness available. She stayed there until the cold from the bark entered her palm. When she returned inside, she did not begin counting, planning, or repairing. Not yet. The morning had become too full for work. She lifted the tin box with the painted roses and opened it again, this time more carefully. The bronze medal lay where she had left it, the ribbon faded to a tired wash of red. White and blue. The lock of hair. The ring. The dark tintypes. The funeral card. Each object had waited without explanation, and still each seemed less mysterious after the letter, as if Miriam's voice had opened a door and allowed them to be ordinary human things. At the bottom of the tin, under a folded scrap of black paper, Elara found a short beeswax candle wrapped in muslin. It was the color of old cream, thick at the base, slightly bent from long storage. A brittle paper band around it read Christmas Eve 1898 in ink almost too faded to read. Perhaps it had been saved from a church service. Perhaps a family table. Perhaps from a box of things no one could bear to use and no one could bear to discard. She held it to her nose. The scent was faint but present. Honey. Dust. A closed drawer. 60 years could not measure it. More. It had outlasted hands. Wars. Debts. Fashions. And the closing of the shop. It had waded through demolition notices, rain in the roof, mice in the walls, and the county's slow machinery. A candle is made to disappear by giving light, yet this one had been spared all its life. Elara found a chipped saucer behind the counter, washed it with boiled water, and set the candle upright in a puddle of warmed wax from its own base. She placed it on the work table near the folded letter. Then she struck one of Amos's matches. The first match broke. The second flared, sulphur-sharp in the cold room. She held it to the wick. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the wick darkened, took a blue bead of flame, and opened into a small, steady light. The room changed. Not enough for warmth. Not enough for work. Just enough for witness. The flame trembled when wind moved under the side door. It shone along the brass edge of the ruler, caught the curve of the shears, touched the raised letters on the press nameplate, and made the folded letter cast a shadow longer than itself. Elara sat before it and watched wax soften at the wick. She did not name what moved through her. Naming would have made it smaller. Instead, she began to remember the chain that had brought her to that table. The bus driver who had warned her about the distance without making her feel foolish. The librarian with silver hair who had let her sit in the local history room day after day without pressing for a reason. Mrs. Kiefer, who had placed 2 peppermints on the deed envelope and given her the photograph from the file. Doris, who had put bread and an egg in a paper bag and turned away before gratitude could become embarrassing. Amos Hirschberger, who had opened an account in a ledger because debt written honestly was less wounding than charity offered carelessly. None of them had saved her. That mattered, too. They had not taken over her life, named her helpless, or made her explain the locked door in York. They had simply placed one small, usable thing within reach. A route. A chair. A key. A meal. A brush for the chimney. Kindness had not arrived as rescue. It had arrived as a series of modest tools. Maybe you have known a kindness like that. Not the public kind with applause around it, but the quiet one no one else noticed. A neighbor scraping snow from your steps before dawn. A nurse warming the blanket before she brings it to the bed. A stranger holding a door when your hands are full. A teacher letting you sit after class until you can speak. Someone paying for coffee and leaving before you can refuse. If a small mercy ever kept you from falling farther than you did, write it down somewhere, even if only in your own mind. There are people listening tonight who may need to be reminded that careful goodness still travels, often under plain coats, often without witnesses, often in amounts too small for the world to count. Elara watched the candle burn lower. Outside, the afternoon shifted. The sun moved from the east wall to the floor and then toward the front windows, where it entered in thin bands between boards. Dust turned gold in those bands, then gray again when clouds passed. The shop seemed less deserted under the candle's modest light, though nothing in it had been repaired since morning. The roof still leaked. The pump water still needed boiling. The floor still had a hollow place near the southwest corner. The front door remained nailed shut from the outside. Yet the building no longer felt ownerless. Toward evening, Elara made a small fire in the clean chimney, using only enough scrap to warm water and heat the last of the potato broth Doris had sent. She did not spend any of the hidden money that day. She did not even move it from the fire safe except to place the letter, the poems, and the metal in a dryer arrangement. The bills stayed wrapped. The coins stayed in their cloth pouch. The sealed packet remained sealed. She had learned already that opening everything at once was another form of greed. Before dark, she folded the letter into a square of clean muslin and set it beside the poems. The metal she wrapped separately, not knowing yet where it belonged, but understanding it did not belong loose among tools. The old candle, burned down by half, she pinched carefully with damp fingers and saved the remaining portion for another night when the room might need remembering again. Then she prepared her place on the floor. It was not much improved. The coat beneath her shoulder, the backpack as a pillow, the apron folded near her chest. But now the heirloom tools lay on the work table above her, wrapped again in oilcloth. The fire safe sat within arm's reach. The letter rested beneath the brass ruler. The tin box stood closed, with the metal inside its muslin. Around these things, she arranged herself not as a guard exactly, and not as a child among treasures, but as someone sleeping at the edge of a newly discovered responsibility. Rain did not come that night. The silence deepened in its place. She lay awake longer than she wished, listening to the building settle around the little remaining warmth from the chimney. Every few minutes a walnut struck the ground outside with a muffled knock. A wagon passed far off on the road. The mice were less bold with the fire scent in the room, or perhaps she simply noticed them less. Near midnight she reached up and touched the folded apron where it lay across her ribs. Elias's blue stitches were there under her fingers. E. M. W. 3 small letters made by hand, meant for a girl standing on a crate beside a press. She followed the thread with one fingertip and felt, not certainty, but a line strong enough to hold until morning. At last she slept, with the heirlooms beside her and Miriam's words folded in the keeping dark. The first snow came on December 4, beginning before dawn as a fine, almost hesitant sift across the lane and becoming, by noon, a measured fall that covered the weeds, the lean-to roof, the outhouse path, and the broken glass behind the shop with 3 inches of white. Elara watched it from the back room with the repair manual open on the work table and a pencil tucked behind her ear in imitation of Amos Hirschberger. She had read the chapter on roof repair twice already, once too quickly and once aloud, because saying the words gave the instructions a steadier place in the room. On the third reading she copied the necessary sections into the margins of a grocery sack. Locate rafters. Remove failed shingles. Inspect sheathing. Sister cracked members. Lay felt with overlap. Strike chalk line. Set shingles square. Nail high enough to hold and low enough not to split. The book made it sound like order could be lifted to the roof in clean steps. The ceiling above her corrected that optimism. During November she had lived by buckets. A coffee can under the leak near the paper rack. A dishpan beneath the drip beside the work table. The galvanized bucket near the chimney breast. an enamel basin found in the lean-to beneath the worst place in the front room. When rain came hard, the shop spoke in separate waters. Tin note, hollow note, soft note into plaster, sharp note onto wood. She had learned each leak the way she had learned the floor's warnings, and by December she knew there could be no slow restoration below until the roof stopped letting the sky come in. She measured from the ground first, using twine, the brass ruler, and the old piker rule because no proper tape measure had yet been bought. The main roof was roughly 38 feet long and 22 feet wide from eave to eave, a modest gable pitched steep enough to shed snow if its surface were sound. The rear slope was worse, with broken cedar shingles curled like dry leaves in two areas where the sheathing had softened under old leaks. The lean-to added another 12 by 16 feet, tin patched badly over older boards. She drew the roof on brown paper. Then she counted. 20 bundles of asphalt shingles would cover the main roof if waste stayed low, though Amos advised 22 because roofs punished optimism. 2 rolls of 15-pound felt. 1 roll of flashing for the chimney. 6 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch. 2 pounds of 8-penny common nails. 4 sister rafters cut from 2 by 6 pine, each 10 feet. 2 sheets of 1/2-inch exterior plywood for patches, though Amos frowned at plywood over older plank sheathing and told her to use it only where rot had eaten through. 1 chalk line. 1 roofing knife. 1 pry bar. A tin of roof cement for the chimney's temporary collar until proper masonry could be done in January. The list came to more than she wished to see. She took money from the fire safe in the least grand manner possible, 1 old 20 and 2 5s, recorded in the repair manual under the heading Roof, beside the date. Then she walked to the hardware store with the bills folded inside the paper sleeve of her lap, as she had once carried the $3, and asked Amos to order only what could not be scavenged, borrowed, or delayed. He listened while weighing nails into brown sacks. When she finished, he went into the back room and was gone long enough for the front bell to ring twice. He returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle darkened by use and a square gauge built into the head. The metal was spotted, but the edge had been recently honed. "Belonged to my wife's brother," he said. "He roofed barns from here to Gap until his knees went." "I cannot buy that." "Did not say buy. I should not take it. You should not drop it." She held it with both hands. The balance surprised her. It was heavier near the head, direct in its intention, not elegant but exact. "What was his name?" she asked. "I will bring it back." Amos nodded once. "Bring yourself back." The skilled help arrived 2 days later without arrangement. Elara was standing on the ladder, one hand gripping the gutter and the other testing a rotten shingle, when a voice below said, "That ladder wants leveling." She looked down. A narrow man in a brown wool coat stood in the snow beside the walnut tree, his black hat low over his brow, a folded measuring rule in one hand. His face was long, sun-browned despite the season, and seamed around the mouth in the way of someone who had spent a life holding nails between his lips. He had white hair at the temples, no beard, and eyes the pale gray of Winter Creek water. "Sir, your ladder is biting soft on the left." She came down carefully. He introduced himself as Gideon Stoltzfus, retired roofer, though he said the word retired as if it were an accusation. He had heard from Amos that the girl at Wenger's place meant to put a roof on before Christmas. He had walked over after morning chores to see whether the rumor was foolish. "Is it?" Elara asked. He studied the roof, the ladder, the stacked shingles, the clouds, her gloves, and the hatchet tucked into her belt. Some foolishness can be taught down. He would not take pay. Not money, Not food, not even coffee, which she did not have enough of anyway. When she tried to insist, he looked at the shop sign and said his father had once brought harness labels here to be printed, and that debts did not always wear the same coat when they returned. They worked 11 days, not all in a row because weather chose its own Sabbath. Gideon taught in short sentences, most of them 5 words long and none padded for comfort. Step where rafter lives. Keep your hips low. Water winds against her. Cut once. Look twice. That nail's proud. Pull it. He made her sister the cracked rear rafter before any shingle went down. They braced the roof from inside with a temporary post beneath the worktable beam, then climbed into the narrow space below the roof through a plaster gap and fitted a sound 2x6 alongside the old split member. Gideon showed her how to clamp it tight, drill pilot holes, and fasten it with staggered screws so the new wood carried load without asking the old wood to become young again. "Do not shame the old," he said, tightening the last screw. "Help it." They stripped the worst shingles by hand, saving any cedar sound enough for kindling or later patchwork on the lean-to. The roofing hatchet's blades slid beneath curled edges. The pry bar lifted nails with a dry squeal. Rotten sheathing came up in dark, soft pieces that smelled of rain held too long. Elara's gloves tore at the thumb, her knees bruised from crouching on cold boards. Snow melted through the seat of her skirt on the first day, until she learned to kneel on folded burlap. The chalk line fascinated her. Gideon snapped it across the felt with a clean blue mark, straight as printed rule. He made her snap the next one. Her first line bowed. He said nothing, simply pointed to the middle. She rewound the line, set the hook again, lifted, snapped. Better. By the 4th course she understood that shingles, like type, could look forgiving one by one and become crooked as a whole if the first line was careless. He taught her the 3-stroke nail. First stroke to set. Second to drive. Third to seat, not bury. The head must lie flat, not proud, not crushed through the shingle. Overdriven nails were a kind of impatience. Underdriven nails invited wind. She heard his voice in the rhythm until the hatchet seemed to speak it by itself. Set. Drive. Seat. By the 7th day her wrists ached through the night. By the 9th, she could cut a shingle tab cleanly with the roofing knife against scrapboard. By the 10th, they flashed the chimney temporarily, bending metal around brick that would need better work in January. Gideon made her tar only what must be tarred. "Tar hides sins," he said. "Use little." On December 15, under a hard blue sky, they set the last ridge cap on the main roof. Gideon made her nail the final piece. He stood below with 1 foot on the ladder and 1 hand on the rung, watching without comment. The wind moved over the fields. From somewhere beyond Queen Road came the thin sound of sleigh bells, though no snow lay on the pavement anymore. Elara drove the last nail in 3 strokes. The head seated clean. She looked at it longer than necessary. That night, rain came instead of snow. It crossed the roof in a wide, steady whisper, moved down the new shingles, entered the gutters where gutters still existed, and fell away from the walls. Inside, Elara placed the buckets in their old positions out of habit. Then she waited. No drop struck the work table. No water fell beside the paper rack. The enamel basin remained empty. She slept beneath a roof that had begun, cautiously, to keep its word. January made the brick show its illness. The roof had stopped the worst rain, but cold brought another kind of honesty. Each morning the chimney breast appeared dusted at the joints with pale powder, mortar loosening grain by grain where damp and freeze had worked for years. Several bricks near the thimble had begun to spall, their faces flaking away in thin red scales. Outside, the west face of the chimney showed deeper trouble, open joints, a vertical crack below the crown, and two courses near the top that leaned just enough to make Elara avoid looking at them from certain angles. Almas came to inspect it on January 3. Carrying a canvas bag of tools and wearing the same brown knit cap he had claimed was lost and found. He stood in the back room with his hands on his hips, looking at the brickwork through his good eye. "Fire wants a clean road," he said. "Yours has potholes. I cleaned the flue. You cleaned the throat. Now mend the body." He tapped the mortar with a cold chisel. Powder fell. He pressed one thumb against a spalled brick and the face came away with almost no resistance. "Do not use Portland cement here." The warning came before she had asked the question. "It is what the store sells most. Most people do not ask old brick what it needs." He explained while she wrote. Hydraulic lime. Washed sand. Fire clay near the heat. Mortar weaker than the brick. Never stronger, so the wall could breathe and move without sacrificing its face. For the inner fire-warmed joints, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay, 3 parts sharp sand. For exterior repointing away from direct heat, 1 part lime to 2.5 parts sand. Mix damp, not soupy, and press deep after the old joint had been raked back twice its height. "You are not icing cake," Amos said. "You are packing a wound." He loaned her a pointing trowel, a narrow joint raker, a brick hammer, and a stiff brush. From the yard behind the store he sold her reclaimed soft red bricks for 12 cents each, close in color and age to the chimney, and better than new hard brick that would have sat there like a false tooth. She bought 18, though he advised 24. She bought 24. The repair manual received another entry. Each item listed, each dollar assigned. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s. Cold changed mortar. It slowed the set, stiffened the hands, and punished any mixture left exposed too long. Elara learned to mix small batches in the galvanized bucket, using water warm near the stove but not hot. She soaked replacement bricks first, so they would not steal moisture from the mortar too quickly. She raked joints until her shoulders burned, brushed out dust, misted the old brick lightly, then pressed mortar in layers, working from the back of each joint outward. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb. Gloves were too clumsy for the careful work, so she wore them between tasks and removed them when placing mortar. The first numbness felt merely cold. The second became pain. By the third, her fingers lost their obedience, and she had to stand near the little fire, palms open, until sensation returned in a bright, needling rush. She did not curse. She counted instead. 20 breaths near heat. Back to the wall. Pack. Press. Strike. Brush. The spalled bricks near the thimble had to come out. Amos showed her the first one, cutting the joint around it with the chisel and tapping not hard, but truly. The brick loosened, shifted, and came free in his hand with the soft scrape of old masonry surrendering. Behind it the cavity smelled of cold soot and damp clay. "Now you," he said. The second brick took her 40 minutes. She was too timid at first, then too forceful, then forced to stop and listen through the chisel. Brick spoke by vibration. Sound brick rang slightly. Failed mortar sighed. A hidden crack changed the note. By afternoon she had removed 4 without damaging their neighbors, and Amos left her with instructions to cover the open work with burlap at night. For exterior repairs she borrowed Gideon's ladder, leveled it with boards, and climbed only as high as prudence allowed. The upper courses would need warmer weather and better scaffolding, so she repaired what she could reach and packed the crown temporarily with lime mortar and sheet metal beneath a flat stone. Not proper, not final, but honest enough to turn winter aside. Inside, the chimney began to look less wounded. Fresh mortar dried pale against the aged brick, too visible at first, but Amos told her it would settle with smoke and years. She replaced the thimble collar, sealed around it with the fireclay mix, and cleaned the flue again after the masonry work, because dust and loosened soot had fallen during repair. Late January brought the test. The date was January 27. Cold and dry, with a wind from the northwest that pressed against the shop walls but left the sky clear. Elara had waited 3 full days after the final interior mortar, longer than the manual required for a small test fire, because patience costs less than chimney fire. She set the bucket of water nearby, opened the draft, and lit a twist of newspaper under 2 sticks of dry cedar saved from the roof work. The flame caught. Smoke rose. For 1 hard second, it hesitated at the thimble, blue and uncertain. Then the chimney drew with a strength she had not felt before. The smoke entered, climbed, and disappeared. Outside, she hurried through the back door and looked up. A thin gray line lifted from the repaired crown and was taken east by the wind. Clean. She stood in the yard with mortar-scared hands tucked under her arms and watched smoke leave the chimney the way breath leaves a living chest. When she returned inside, the little fire had begun to warm the brick around it. Not much. Enough. The wall held heat differently now, not as a cracked vessel losing everything through its seams, but as something repaired sufficiently to remember its purpose. That evening she heated beans, onion, and the last heel of bread on the stovepipe shelf Amos had helped her rig from scrap. The meal was plain and slightly smoky. She ate from the coffee can and read 3 poems from Miriam's bundle by firelight, not yet aloud, not yet as possession, only as company. The floors waited until the chimney could hold heat, and then they demanded more than she had expected. White pine planks ran through the front room and into the back, wide boards of uneven width, some 14 inches, some 10, one near the counter nearly 16 and cupped along its length like a shallow trough. Hand-cut rosehead nails held many of them, their square shoulders dark in the grain. Later repairs had added wire nails here and there, less graceful, more hurried. Near the southwest corner, water had raised the fibers until the surface felt like a washboard under her hand. She could not restore everything. She understood that by then. Restoration was not returning a place to its first day. It was deciding what damage had become memory and what damage still threatened the life of the room. She lifted only the boards that had gone soft near the wall, numbering each with pencil before moving it. Beneath them lay joists darkened but sound at the edges, soft only where old leaks had fed rot. A short sister joist, 2 blocking pieces, and a patch from salvage pine made the corner safe enough to walk. She drove cut nails by hand, pre-drilling where the old boards might split, and set each nail head just below the surface with a punch Amos had lent her. Then came sanding. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day from a tool counter outside Lancaster seemed, at first, too loud for the shop. Its motor broke the winter hush and sent mice fleeing into walls. Elara read the instructions twice, fitted the dust bag badly, corrected it, and began in the back room where mistakes would be less visible. The first pass used 80 grit, rough enough to take down raised grain, old finish, water ridges, and decades of embedded dirt. She moved with the grain, slow and overlapping, never letting the machine sit in one place long enough to make a hollow. Dust rose anyway. Pine dust. Old varnish dust. Plaster dust awakened from cracks. It settled on her sleeves, eyelashes, and the folded map she had forgotten to cover. She stopped every hour to sweep and empty the dust bag into a sack, then carried the sack outside and tied it against damp. The sound of sanding filled her skull even after she stopped, a phantom hum behind the ears. The first pass revealed color. Not clean beauty. Not yet. But beneath grayware lay a deepening honey tone, darker near the counter, almost amber where human feet had passed for years. The second pass, with 120 grit, softened the scratches left by the first. The third, with 220, required patience she had nearly spent. By then her hands tingled from vibration, and her back had tightened until standing straight became a separate task. She returned the sander after 2 days, owing $28 plus the cost of discs, and walked back in freezing rain with her shoulders aching and her coat smelling of pine dust. Oil came next. Amos argued for tongue oil cut for penetration. Doris, overhearing this at the cafe while wrapping a loaf, said her grandfather had used boiled linseed oil and never apologized to a floor in his life. Gideon, when asked, said only, thin coats. White back. Elara chose a mixture, because old rooms often accept compromise better than doctrine. First coat, tongue oil thinned, worked into the boards with rags until the wood drank and then refused. She waited 30 minutes, wiped back every shining place, and hung the oily rags outside flat over a wire, because Amos had warned her twice about spontaneous combustion. The second coat, 48 hours later, held more on the surface. The third, after another 48-hour cure, included a little boiled linseed oil for warmth and smell, though she kept the room ventilated despite the cold. The color changed slowly, then all at once. Dark honey came first, running along the grain. Then, near the oldest boards by the press, a deeper tone rose through the pine. Something close to mahogany, though not as red. A warmth that seemed to have been waiting under grayness for a hand to call it back. Nail heads darkened. Saw marks appeared. Old scars took oil differently, some nearly black, some pale as bone. The floor did not become new. It became legible. On January 30, she had the bad morning. It began with no dramatic cause. The chimney drew. The roof held. The floor's first coat had cured well. There was food enough for 2 days, money accounted for, and a page of tasks waiting. Yet when she bent to lift the oil can, her hands simply remained on the lid. She could not make them turn it. The shop was too large. The winter too long. The tools too many. The letter too generous. Her body had obeyed for months and now sat down inside itself like a worker refusing unsafe orders. She put on her coat and left the shop without locking the side door. The drainage run had widened after rain, and beyond it, where the land flattened toward a low marshy field, water stood among dead grasses and silver sheets. Elara walked there carefully, stepping from hummock to hummock until she reached a fallen log at the edge. She sat. For a long while, nothing happened. Then a great blue heron lifted from the far side of the marsh. It rose slowly, with a prehistoric patience that made the air seem older around it. Its wings opened, beat once, then again, carrying its long legs behind and its neck folded into that strange, deliberate shape herons keep in flight. It crossed the pale winter sky without hurry and settled near the drainage run, where it stood in water no deeper than its ankles, still as a figure cut from slate. Elara watched it until her breathing changed. The heron did not work. It did not justify its stillness. It waited because waiting belonged to its nature and did not require apology. She stayed there until afternoon. She ate nothing. She repaired nothing. She did not read, count money, plan materials, or return to town. When cold finally drove her back, the shop stood as she had left it, imperfect and unoffended. The side door had blown open 2 inches. A leaf lay on the oiled floor near the counter. She picked it up, set it outside, and made tea from hot water and a strip of lemon peel Doris had tucked into a bag days before. The next morning she returned to the floors. The house was patient. So was she. February entered through the windows because the windows had been inviting it for years. There were 8 in all, not counting the boarded transom over the front door. 3 had no glass left, only empty muntins and shards held like teeth along the lower rails. 4 were cracked, some in simple diagonal lines, others in starbursts from stones, storms, or thrown branches. 1, on the north side of the back room above the paper rack, still held its original wavy glass, hand-blown and imperfect, with small bubbles suspended inside it like trapped breath. Amos dated that sash to the 18th century, reused perhaps from an older building when the shop was built onto an earlier storage room. He was not certain about the year, but when Elara cleaned the lower corner and found 1788 scratched faintly into the wood beside a carpenter's mark, he stood back and removed his cap. "Do not replace that one," he said. "I was not going to." "Good. Some glass has seen more than we have." She began with the broken 3. Window work required a different patience than roof or chimney. Less strength, more fingertips. She removed the sashes one at a time, numbering them in pencil and laying them on the work table over folded burlap. Old glazing putty came away in stubborn pieces, hard as bone near the edges and soft in damp corners. She used a putty knife warmed near the stove, easing it under the line of putty until it lifted without tearing too much wood. Glazier's points came out with needle-nose pliers. Many rusted to flakes. The replacement glass came from the back room of Hirschberger Hardware, where Amos kept panes salvaged from storms, barn windows, and houses remodeled by people impatient with maintenance. He helped her choose glass that did not look too new. Slight waves, tiny imperfections, thickness near enough to the remaining panes. He cut them on a felt-covered bench, scoring once, cleanly, then snapping the piece downward with both hands. "Glass here's doubt," he said. "Score like you mean it." She bought a can of DAP 33 glazing putty, its surface smooth and pale under the lid, smelling faintly of linseed and chalk. Amos made her knead a lump in her palm until it warmed and softened. Then he showed her the motion: bed the glass in a thin cushion of putty, press gently along the edges, set the glazier's points without forcing, roll a putty rope between the palms, lay it against the sash, and draw the knife at a steady angle so the bevel shed water away from wood. Her first line looked lumpy. She scraped it off and began again. By the second sash, the line improved. By the third, she could pull the putty knife from corner to corner in one deliberate stroke, leaving a clean bevel that caught light along its edge. She learned to miter the corners with the knife tip and to dust her fingers with whiting when the putty clung too much. She learned that cold putty fought and warm putty sagged. She learned to leave the sashes flat long enough for the bedding to settle before lifting them. The cracked 4 took longer because they required decisions. Not every crack demanded replacement. One pane in the front room had a single line from upper left to lower right, but the glass held firm in the crack. Once cleaned, looked like a quiet stroke of ink across the view. She left it for later. Another pane flexed when the wind came through and had to be replaced. A third, in the sidewall, had broken at the corner and admitted water into the muntin joint. That one came out in pieces wrapped in newspaper. The sash cords were their own education. 2 windows had weights still in their pockets, but no working cord. The old rope had rotted to black fuzz where it passed over the pulleys. Amos sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord and made her practice the figure-8 knot on a drawer pull until she could tie it without looking. The knot had to be large enough not to slip through the counterweight eye, compact enough not to jam in the pocket, and honest enough to trust while the sash hung above her fingers. She opened the weight pocket carefully, fishing out the iron counterweight with a bent coat hanger. It came up dusty and cold, marked with a cast number. She tied the figure-8 knot through its eye, tested it with both hands, then fed the cord over the pulley and attached it to the sash groove. The first time the sash rose and stayed open, balanced by weight hidden in the wall, she laughed once under her breath. It was a small sound. The shop accepted it. For several days the front room held sashes in various states of cure, laid across chairs, crates, and the counter. Light entered more cleanly with each repair. Not brightly, because February light in Pennsylvania has a restrained character, but honestly. The boards over the windows came down one at a time. Nail holes remained in the frames. Paint had peeled in long strips. Some muntins bore knife scars from hands long dead. Still, the room began to look outward. The last window was the 1788 sash. Elara did not remove its glass. She cleaned it in place, using warm water, a little vinegar, and cloth soft enough not to scratch. The old pane bent the world beyond it. Walnut branches wavered. The lane shifted when she moved her head. The sky gathered in slight distortions, as if the past did not reflect straight lines and never had. The putty around that pane had failed in 2 places, so she repaired only what was necessary, pressing new DAP 33 into the gaps beside the old putty rather than stripping the whole line. The knife moved slowly. The glass trembled faintly under pressure. She held her breath and released it only when the bevel lay smooth. Outside, on a walnut branch just beyond the window, a chickadee landed. It was so near she could see the black cap, the white cheek, the tiny feet gripping bark. The bird tilted its head and regarded the room through the wavy pane, unafraid or too quick to be troubled. It hopped once, pecked at something in the bark, then fluffed itself against the cold. Elara remained still with the putty knife in her hand. The chickadee stayed for 7 breaths, maybe 8, then lifted into the air and vanished toward the lane. When the last window was done, the shop did not feel finished. It felt less abandoned. That was all, and that was enough for February. Late February exposed the walls. Once the roof held, the chimney drew, the floor took oil, and the windows no longer admitted every passing wind. The plaster could no longer hide behind greater emergencies. It had been failing all along, but failing patiently, the way walls fail when they have been asked to keep too much weather, too much smoke, and too many winters on the wrong side of themselves. The original plaster was horsehair over hand-split oak lath. Elara learned this by kneeling near the chimney breast, where a loose patch had sagged away from the wall and revealed the brown ribs beneath. The last strips were uneven, split by hand rather than sawn, each one nailed with small blackened nails, and set apart just enough to hold the plaster keys that had squeezed through and hardened behind them. When she touched one of the old keys, it broke between her fingers like a stale biscuit. 3 patches had failed near the chimney. The first was at shoulder height, where heat had dried and loosened the finish coat until it sounded hollow under a knuckle. The second lay near the baseboard, damaged by damp before the roof repair. The third was above the thimble, where the wall had cracked in a rough map of islands and rivers. She marked the edges with pencil, not square, but following the sound. Solid plaster rang close and firm. Failed plaster answered dull and tired. Amos had a bag of horsehair in his store attic, left from the 1950s, tied with string and labeled in a hand not his own. He brought it down with dust on his sleeves and stood on the ladder shaking his head. "Kept because someone might need it," he said. "Did you know someone?" "No. That is why a man keeps things." The hair was coarse, clean enough, and strangely living to the touch after so many years. He showed her how to tease it apart and mix it into lime mortar so it bridged the plaster, giving the wall a quiet strength no powder alone could provide. 3 coats. No haste. The scratch coat went on first, thick enough to push between the lath and form new keys behind it. She pressed with the trowel until her wrist ached, working the lime and sand and horsehair into the gaps, then scratched shallow lines across the wet face with a comb made from nails set through a scrap of wood. Those scratches would give the brown coat something to grip. Without them, Amos said, layers could separate like people who had never learned to hold. The brown coat followed after the scratch had firmed but not died. 3/8 of an inch. She measured first with a scrap gauge, then by eye, though her eye remained humble. It had to stand proud enough to meet the surrounding wall after the finish coat, yet not so proud that the repair announced itself across the room. She worked the surface with long pulls of the trowel, knocking down ridges, filling hollows, misting edges so the old plaster would not steal moisture from the new. Then 72 hours. She did almost nothing to the wall during that time except keep it from drying too quickly. Morning and evening she misted it lightly and watched the color change from dark gray-brown to pale buff. Cold slowed everything. That suited her. She had come to mistrust work that wanted applause before it had cured. The finish coat was thin, 1/8 of an inch, lime-rich and fine, without coarse sand. It frightened her more than the heavy work because it required touch. Too many passes brought the lime to the surface and made it slick. Too few left ridges. She worked with a smaller trowel, breathing through each stroke, feathering the edges into the aged wall rather than pretending new plaster could become old overnight. The 3 patches dried lighter than the surrounding wall. That could not be helped. They would smoke down in time, take dust, take winter, take the passing shadow of hands and shoulders. They would stop looking like repairs and begin looking like years. When she finished the last patch above the thimble, she stood back with the trowel in one hand and her other hand pressed against the ache in her lower back. The fire had burned low. Evening gathered against the repaired windows. On the work table lay Miriam's letter, folded in its muslin, because Elara had taken to keeping it nearby during jobs that required patience beyond her own supply. She looked at the wall and spoke quietly, not to herself exactly, but to the room. "These patches will hold another 100 years. The sentence did not echo. It settled. Doris began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before Elara understood there was a pattern to it. The first appeared on a Monday morning, folded twice at the top and weighted with a flat stone so the wind would not take it. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in waxed paper, a jar of chicken corn soup still faintly warm, and an apple with 1 bruise cut carefully away. There was no note. Elara carried the bag inside, stood near the counter, and looked through the repaired front window toward the lane, as if the giver might still be visible among the walnut shadows. The next bag came Thursday. Bread heels. A boiled egg. A small wedge of cheese. Coffee grounds wrapped in paper. Enough for 1 thin pot. Elara waited until late afternoon, then walked to the cafe with the empty jars washed and tied in a cloth. Doris stood behind the counter rolling pie dough, her auburn hair pinned in the same high knot, flour across one forearm. The cafe smelled of coffee, frying onions, cinnamon, and wet wool from the coats hung near the door. Men talked low over lunch plates. A child tapped a spoon against a glass until his mother placed one hand over his. Elara set the jars on the counter. "I need to pay you." Doris kept rolling. "I have some money now." "I know." The rolling pin moved forward. Back, forward. "Then I should pay." Doris lifted the dough, turned it, and laid it down again. "You can pay in candles when the shop reopens." "I do not make candles." "Then learn or print labels for someone who does." Elara stood with the jars between her hands, unable to shape a proper answer. Doris looked up at last. Her eyes were brown and plain-spoken. "My mother bought wedding place cards from that counter in 1951, she said. Spelled my uncle's name wrong on the list. Printer corrected it without making her feel foolish. She talked about that for 40 years. That was before my time. Most debts are. After that, Elara stopped trying to return the food in money. She returned jars clean. She brought kindling when the cafe woodbox was low. She mended 2 split recipe cards with paste and Japanese tissue from a packet Miriam had stored. Doris accepted these things as if they were ordinary commerce, which made them easier to bear. The bags kept appearing through March. Not daily. Never enough to turn kindness into dependence. Just when weather turned hard, or when Elara had spent too many hours on a ladder, or when the work required hands too cold to cook. Doris seemed to know, though Elara never asked how. Some women, Elara learned, kept account by looking at faces the way clerks kept ledgers. Caleb arrived with noise. A bicycle rattled into the lane one Saturday afternoon, its fenders shaking, its chain clicking, its front basket holding a coil of rope, 2 apples, and a splitting maul wrapped in burlap. The rider was 16, perhaps, narrow as a beanpole, with a long nose, dark hair falling into his eyes, and a jacket too thin for the wind. The bicycle was a red Schwinn with chipped paint, chrome handlebars, and one pedal that squeaked on every third turn. He braked too hard near the walnut tree and nearly fell. "You Miss Whitcomb?" he asked, catching himself with one foot. "Yes. My mother said you need wood split." Elara was standing beside a pile of roof scraps, cedar shakes, broken lath, and thicker pieces scavenged from the lean-to. She had split some with the hatchet, badly. The maul in the boy's basket looked larger than his arms should manage. "I can pay by the hour." He shook his head. "No. Ma'am." "Then I cannot ask you to do." "You did not ask." "My mother said." "Who is your mother?" "Mrs. Kiefer's daughter, Ruth." The name reached Elara through the clerk's photograph on the desk. 3 children in church clothes. Grown now. She looked at Caleb again and saw Adeline's careful eyes beneath the hair. "About your grandfather," he added. He said it awkwardly, as if the rest of the explanation had been delivered to him at home, and he had lost pieces of it along the road. Elara understood enough. Caleb split wood for 2 hours. He was not graceful at first, but he was persistent and less careless than boys often pretend to be. He set each piece upright, measured his stance, lifted the maul, and brought it down with a breath through his teeth. When the wood split clean, his mouth twitched with pleasure. When it did not, he adjusted the piece and tried again. Elara stacked the split wood under the lean-to, bark side up, leaving air between rows as Gideon had taught her. They spoke little. At one point Caleb nodded toward the shop. press still in there? Yes. Does it work? Not yet. I think so. He considered that while setting another piece. My mother says old machines are better when someone knows them. Your mother sounds wise. She says that too. The maul came down. The log split. When he finished, Elara offered him one of Doris's apples. He took it only after she placed it on the chopping block and stepped away, allowing him to pretend it had become part of the landscape. Then he rode off down the lane, the empty basket bouncing, the maul now tied across the rear rack with rope. He returned the next Saturday. Then the next. Sometimes he split wood. Sometimes he held a ladder. Once he carried broken plaster out in buckets and said nothing when dust made his eyes water. He never accepted money. He did accept, after 3 visits, the chance to pull the lever on the tabletop press after Elara had cleaned and oiled it enough for a blind impression. No ink. No paper worth saving. Just pressure. The press closed with a firm, beautiful bite. Caleb looked at the blank sheet afterward, at the rectangle impressed into it by an empty chase. It did something, he said. Yes. It remembered. Reverend Boyd came into the story by walking past. He was pastor of a small church outside the village, though Elara did not learn that until later. At first he was only a tall, elderly man in a black coat, with a brimmed hat, polished shoes, and a gait slowed by age but not uncertainty. Every morning, a little after 8, he walked along Queen Road, past the walnut stand, past the lane, and on toward the covered bridge. Every morning, whether sun, fog, or cutting wind, he lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat when he saw her. He did not stop the first week. He did not stop the second. That restraint made her trust him more than if he had arrived with advice. On the 3rd Monday of March, while Elara was carrying a bucket of plaster debris to the pit behind the outhouse, Reverend Boyd paused at the mouth of the lane. He held his hat in one hand. His hair was white and fine, lifted by the wind. His face had the worn softness of paper handled carefully for many years. "Morning," he said. "Morning, sir. Boyd's my name. Elara Whitcomb." "I know." Everyone seemed to know before asking. He smiled, but only slightly. "May I pray and pass?" She shifted the bucket against her hip. "I suppose." He did not come closer. He did not lay hands on the building, did not bow dramatically, did not ask her story. He simply looked toward the shop, then toward the walnut tree, then lowered his head for the length of one breath. "Keep her through today." 4 words. Then he put his hat back on and continued walking. He did the same the next morning, though from the road and without stopping. Sometimes the words varied. Mercy for this work, bread for the evening, warmth against the cold, never longer, never louder. Prayer, from him, was not a performance but a match struck and cupped from wind. Elara did not know what she believed about God then. Belief had been made difficult by people who used virtue as a ledger and silence as a weapon. Yet she found, as March leaned toward thaw, that the old man's passing prayers did not demand agreement. They took their place among the modest helps: Doris's bag, Caleb's maul, Amos's pencil, Gideon's chalk line, Adeline's key, small things placed within reach. Not one of them saved the shop. But together, they made it harder for the shop to be lost. The cellar had been postponed until February 11 because Elara did not trust underground rooms in winter. It was not fear exactly. It was respect. A condemned building above ground was dangerous enough. Below ground, Danger had fewer witnesses. She had noticed the cellar door her first week, set into the backroom floor near the paper rack, nearly hidden beneath warped boards and 2 collapsed shelves. It had an iron ring handle and hinges furred with rust. Each time she passed it, she promised the cellar another day. February 11 brought clear light, a working chimney, a dry roof, and Caleb willing to stand above with a rope tied around his waist as if he were rescuing a calf from a creek bank. "This is unnecessary," Elara said. "My mother said cellars kill people. Your mother has strong opinion. She reads the newspaper." They cleared the shelves, swept mouse leavings from the door, and worked oil into the hinges. The iron ring lifted with a groan. Cold air rose from below, damp and mineral, smelling of stone, old apples, and earth that had never fully dried. Elara held a lantern over the opening and saw 7 granite steps descending into darkness. "Count out loud," Caleb said. "I can count stairs. My mother—" She looked at him. He did not smile. So she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, fieldstone walls on 3 sides and brick under the chimney. The floor was not dirt, as she had expected, but uneven fieldstone laid close, with damp shining in the low places. Empty shelves lined the east wall, their lower boards rotted away. A broken crock lay in one corner. 3 glass jars, clouded white, stood beneath a ledge. There was no standing water. No animals rushed out. No collapse announced itself. At the center of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It was too regular for the rest of the cellar. 3 feet by 2, perhaps, set level among the rougher stones, its surface smoothed and edged with intention. In the upper right corner, someone had carved a craft mark, a small hand-press symbol, simple as a child's drawing yet exact in its proportions. A rectangle for the bed. A curved lever. 3 short lines beneath, suggesting printed text. Elara crouched near it with the lantern. "Do not lift that," Caleb said from the stairs. "I was not going to. My mother said if there is a big stone in a cellar, leave it until a man with sense comes." Did she name one? No. The slab did not ask to be moved. That was the strange thing. Some hidden places called attention to themselves by being poorly disguised. This one seemed marked for a future with more tools, more knowledge, and perhaps more courage than February could supply. Elara brushed dirt from the craft mark and left it uncovered. Whatever waited there, if anything did, could keep waiting. They searched the shelves instead. Most held little. Dust. A bottle with a cracked lip. A mouse-gnawed crate stamped peaches. A rusted lid from a stovepat. On the lowest shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, she found 2 more packets of blank labels, damp at one edge but usable for practice. Caleb discovered a stack of slate roof tiles behind a barrel and took excessive pride in the find until one broke in his hand. Going up, Elara noticed the 3rd step. Not because of the stone itself, but because the side shadow beneath it did not match the others. The granite stair had been set into the wall, with a small void below where mortar had fallen away. Something dark and square sat wedged in that space, nearly invisible unless the lantern passed low. She knelt on the 4th step and reached beneath the 3rd. Her fingers touched wood. The object resisted. She worked it gently, loosening grit around its edges with the bone folder she had brought from the work table. Caleb leaned over her shoulder with the lantern, breathing too near her ear. "Give me—" "Yes, ma'am." The box came free all at once. dropping into her hand with a weight that made her close both palms around it. It was oak, no larger than a prayer book, darkened by damp but not rotted. The lid had swollen shut. They carried it upstairs before opening it because the cellar air felt too old for revelation. In the back room, on the work table, Elara warmed the edges with her hands, worked the seam with the lifting knife, and raised the lid. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was not large. Its shaft was plain, but the bow had been shaped like the same craft mark carved into the granite slab, a tiny press, rectangular and curved, with 3 short lines for a printed sheet. It had been polished once, perhaps often, then left to darken in the box. When Elara held it near the window, the brass caught a thin strip of February light. The tintype was wrapped in black paper. She unfolded it carefully. A young woman looked back from the dark surface, standing in front of this very shop before weather had taken its paint. She was 25, perhaps, slender, with a long skirt, a white blouse, and an apron tied at the waist. Her hair was pinned high. One hand rested on the side of a tabletop press set outside the doorway for the photograph. Her face was not Elara's exactly. The mouth was narrower, the chin stronger, the eyes set with an older steadiness. Yet the likeness was close enough that Caleb stepped backward. "That is you," he said. "It is." The young woman in the photograph had Elara's gaze, or Elara had hers. The difference did not seem worth arguing. On the back, in brown ink, someone had written, "Miriam Elizabeth Wenger, daughter of Jonas Wenger, age 25, summer of 1903. The date made no arithmetic sense with the letter at first, not until Elara remembered that handwriting on backs of photographs often lied by memory or later hands. Miriam, born in 1894, would not have been 25 in 1903. Perhaps the year had been 1919. Perhaps the age had been copied wrong. Perhaps another Miriam stood there, an aunt or cousin, and the back had been mislabeled. Old records, like old windows, bent the view. Still, the face held. Elara set the photograph beside the letter and the key beside the candle stub. Caleb kept looking from one to the other, uncertain whether he had witnessed something holy or merely confusing. "What does it open?" he asked. "I do not know." "The stone? You going to try all the lock?" "Not." He nodded, relieved or disappointed. That evening, after Caleb rode away on the rattling Schwinn, Elara placed the brass key on the mantel shelf above the chimney breast, where it caught firelight without demanding use. She propped the tintype near Miriam's poems, weighted gently at the edge so it would not curl. The granite slab remained below, marked and undisturbed at the center of the cellar floor. She did not yet know what the key opened. For the first time, not knowing did not feel like deprivation. It felt like a future keeping its manners. By mid-March, snow retreated from the shaded places along the lane and left behind the flattened evidence of winter. Broken twigs, walnut husks softened to black. Mouse tunnels collapsed in the grass. The ground near the pump thawed first on the south side, then held mud deep enough to take the shape of Elara's boots and keep it until rain came. The drainage run grew loud with snowmelt, no longer a thin thread but a narrow brown creek that hurried around stones and carried bits of leaf, straw, and one pale feather past the outhouse and into the low field. The shop changed with the thaw. Not dramatically. Old buildings do not throw off winter like coats. They loosen by degrees. The front door, still nailed but no longer swollen tight, shifted slightly when wind pressed from the lane. The repaired windows gathered mist at their lower edges in the mornings, then cleared by noon. The chimney, warmer now from daily use, held a faint soot scent even when no fire burned. The oiled floor lost its winter chill earlier each day. Outside, the walnut trees showed catkins, small and pendulous, not yet beautiful but alive with intention. Chickadees returned to the branches. A robin worked the muddy ground near the pump. The black dog from the mailbox began wandering farther down the lane and once slept in a patch of sun beside the lean-to until Elara stepped too near and he rose, offended, and went home. By April, she could open 3 windows for an hour at midday. Air moved through the shop and carried out the last heavy smells of mildew, soot, and closed years. In their place came damp earth, creek water, warming brick, and the faint sweetness of bread from Doris's kitchen when the wind came right. Elara washed shelves, sorted type, cleaned the tabletop press piece by piece with rags, oil, and patience. She did not yet attempt the large Chandler and Price beyond wiping its surfaces and oiling what Amos said could safely be oiled without a full inspection. She decided not to begin the craft that spring. The decision surprised those who asked, though few did. Caleb wanted to see ink. Doris wanted labels for jam jars, though she pretended not to care. Amos had rollers he thought could be recovered by a man in Lancaster. Even Mrs. Kiefer, who came once in April with a county envelope and left with tea, looked around the room as if expecting the press to speak soon. Elara understood the hunger. She felt it too. But hunger had ruined enough things in her life. She would not let it rush her hands. She would order materials slowly. Rollers first, if they could be saved. New timpan paper. A modest tin of black ink. Proper solvents. A small packet of good cotton paper. Not for selling. Not yet, but for practice. She would spend 1 coin if she had to. One of the common ones, and record it in the manual. The rest would remain sealed and counted, not because money deserved worship, but because unspent time had to be protected from sudden wanting. She practiced on scraps instead. Blind impressions with no ink. Locking furniture around empty forms. Setting lines of type and redistributing them before printing. Sewing folded waste paper into uneven pamphlets. Making paste in a small pot and noting how long it thickened, how quickly it skinned, how cold changed its body. She failed quietly and kept the failures. They taught without scolding. In late April, on the first evening warm enough to sit outside without a coat, Elara carried a chair to the back step and watched the drainage run glint under the walnut shadows. The shop behind her held its repaired walls, its patched roof, its oiled floor, its mended windows, its hidden box, its unread future beneath the cellar slab, and the brass key on the mantel. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Elara finished the first piece that felt worthy of the shop. Snow lay along the lane in narrow ridges where the wind had combed it from the fields, and the walnut trees stood bare against a sky the color of pewter. The shop windows glowed at dusk, not brightly, but with a steady amber made from 2 lamps and the small fire in the chimney. The front door opened now. Its bell had been rehung above the frame. Not original, perhaps, but close enough in sound that Mrs. Kiefer said it made her think of errands she had not run since girlhood. The piece lay on the work table under a clean muslin cloth. It was a hand-bound book of 16 pages, sewn with linen thread, covered in deep moss bookcloth from Miriam's package, and printed on a small run of cotton rag paper Elara had bought in Lancaster after saving for it through 3 repair jobs and a season of modest label work. The title page had been set by hand in 12-point Caslin, with a border of tiny acorn ornaments from the hidden packet. She had printed it on the tabletop press first. Then, when her confidence in the rollers allowed, on the Chandler and Price for the final sheets. The book contained 12 of Miriam's poems. Not all. Not the private ones. Not the pieces that belonged to grief so intimate that printing them would have felt like opening a bedroom drawer. Elara chose the poems that looked outward: Walnut Leaves, Winter Bread, A Baby's Funeral Card, A Woman Setting Type After Midnight, A Soldier's Unanswered Letter Folded into a Hymnal. She printed 40 copies. Not 50. 40 felt honest. More would have been ambition wearing another name. The first copy she did not sell. She wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with cotton string, and placed it in the fire safe where the poems had slept for decades. The second went to Mrs. Kiefer, the third to Amos, the fourth to Doris, who tried to pay and was refused in the same tone she had once used over biscuits. The fifth went to Caleb, now taller, his voice lower, his red Schwinn replaced by a dented pickup he had bought with summer wages. Reverend Boyd received the sixth and held it so gently Elara had to look away. The interior of the shop had become neither polished nor quaint. That was important. The front room still had its scarred counter, though cleaned, oiled, and repaired at the left corner where a split had run nearly through. Behind it, shelves held paper wrapped against dust, finished cards in labeled boxes, jars of pencils, string, beeswax, and the old calling cards found in the drawer. The front windows showed their wavy imperfections, and one cracked pane remained deliberately in place, stabilized but not replaced, a fine diagonal line crossing the view of the lane. The back room held the large press, working now with a new belt and recovered rollers, its flywheel dark and quiet until called. The tabletop press stood near the window for smaller jobs. Type cases lined the wall, each drawer cleaned, relabeled, and never forced. The plaster patches had already begun to soften into the rest of the wall. The floor bore new scuffs over old scars. Heat from the chimney made the brick smell faintly of lime, soot, and winter meals. On the mantel sat the brass key. For nearly 2 years it had remained there, moved only for dusting, admired by visitors who did not know its weight in the hand. Elara had tried it in the side door, the front door, the old desk drawer, the cellar door ring, a rusted trunk Amos found in his storage shed, and the lockbox where she now kept customer deposits. It fit nothing. Caleb had suggested it belonged to the granite slab. Gideon said keys were often made for locks already lost. Doris said some keys were meant to teach restraint, which made Amos roll his eye and ask whether restraint had a keyhole. The answer came in winter, after an ice storm. On December 18, 2 days after freezing rain silvered every branch in the walnut stand, a limb broke from the north side of the old tree behind the shop. It did not fall entirely, but cracked and hung, dangerous above the place where the horseshoe had grown into the bark. Caleb came with a saw. Amos came with wedges. Gideon, older and slower but still severe, came to supervise without admitting concern. They cut the limb in sections and lowered each with rope. When the last weight came away, a strip of bark tore loose near the horseshoe. Behind it, half hidden by growth and ice, was a small brass plate sunk into the trunk. No one spoke for several seconds. The plate was green with age, its edges swallowed by living wood. At its center was a keyhole shaped not like any modern lock, but narrow and hand-cut, set beneath the same little press mark carved into the cellar slab and shaped into the bow of the brass key. Elara went inside and took the key from the mantel. By then the sun had dropped low, and the ice on the branches held the light in sharp fragments. The air smelled of cut walnut, clean and bitter. She stood below the embedded horseshoe with Caleb on one side, Amos on the other, Gideon behind, and Doris farther back with her arms folded against the cold. Reverend Boyd had happened to be walking past, or perhaps had seen the gathering and understood that some moments ask for witness. The key entered stiffly. Elara turned it with both hands. At first nothing moved. Then, deep inside the tree, something gave a small metallic click. A narrow section of the brass plate loosened and opened outward, no larger than a book cover, revealing a hollow lined in tin. The compartment had been made when the tree was younger, then slowly enclosed by growth, protected by bark, iron, and years. Inside lay a folded flag and a note. The flag was wool, faded but whole, with 48 stars arranged in rows. Elara lifted it with both hands, and even the cold seemed to pause around its edges. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a paper dated November 11, 1919. The handwriting was different from Miriam's letter. Older, stronger in the downstrokes. The note was brief enough to read under the tree. For the one who keeps the shop after the guns have stopped. This flag flew in the window the day the armistice bells rang, and again 1 year later when we spoke the names of those who did not cross back over the water. My son Samuel Wenger was among them. If this tree lives longer than I do, let it hold what I cannot carry without breaking. Let whoever opens this remember that a country is not an idea only, but also a kitchen where a mother stands when the letter comes, and a shop where his name is set in type because speaking it is not enough. Keep the flag dry. Keep the work honest. Clara Wenger, mother of Sam. November 11, 1919. Elara read it once beneath the walnut tree, then once again inside by the fire, because paper that old deserved warmth and a table. The 1918 medal from the tin box found its place after that. It had belonged, they learned through county records and Reverend Boyd's patient calls to a historical society, to Samuel Wenger, killed during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the final weeks of the Great War. His name appeared on a memorial roll at a church cemetery outside Leola, not far from where his mother had once stood waiting for news. On November 11, 2025, Elara carried the medal there wrapped in muslin. She did not make a ceremony large enough to embarrass the dead. Mrs. Kiefer came. Reverend Boyd came. Caleb drove Amos and Gideon. Doris brought coffee in a thermos and slices of apple cake wrapped in waxed paper. They stood by the stone while the wind moved through dry grass. Elara did not leave the medal in the ground or surrender it to a case. She held it, read Samuel's name aloud once, and afterward placed a printed card against the cemetery marker for the day, weighted with a small stone. The card said, Samuel Wenger,
1896-1918.
Kept in remembrance. By evening, the medal returned to the shop, where it rested in the tin box with the flag note, Miriam's letter, and the tintype of the young woman whose face still unsettled visitors who saw Elara nearby. The money remained mostly untouched. In the beginning, Elara had feared using it. Later she feared hoarding it for the wrong reason. So she made rules and wrote them in the repair manual, the same book that held chimney notes, roof measurements, plaster ratios, oil mixtures, and lists of days when she had done no work because weather or spirit required mercy. Money may be used for structural repair. Money may be used for heat, food, tax, health, and tools necessary to keep the trade alive. Money may not be used to impress. Money may not be used to prove safety to people who abandon their duty. Money must leave a record when it leaves the box. Over 2 years she spent only what the building required. 3 silver coins were sold through a reputable dealer in Lancaster after Amos insisted she learn their worth before letting them go. 1 common wheat penny. Worn nearly smooth, she kept in the cash drawer as a talisman and sometimes used under a form as a reminder not to over-tighten the coins. The paper bills paid for roofing, masonry materials, legal filings, roller recovery, insurance, and the first cautious supplies. Each expenditure was written down, dated, and folded into a separate envelope. The rest returned to the fire safe. Not as treasure. Not as fear. As a lamp left for the next one. Those were Miriam's words, though Elara shortened them in practice. The next one. Whoever came after. Blood or not. Hungry or not. Ready or not. Some future hand might need time more than it needed instruction, and she knew now that time could be hidden in a box as surely as currency. The shop reopened without announcement. No ribbon. No newspaper article. No sign painter from out of town. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for laying hens and a lost barn cat. Letterpress print, small runs, labels, cards, memorial verses. Wenger and Daughters, Queen Road, Watkins by chance, orders by mile. Elara objected to the name at first because she had not chosen it. Doris said the old sign had once read Wenger and Sons, and a corrected history was not vanity. Amos said daughters plural sounded sturdier than daughter singular. Mrs. Kiefer said nothing, but the next county envelope arrived addressed to Wenger and Daughters, care of Elara Whitcomb, and that settled the matter more officially than any conversation. The mailing list grew slowly. 12 names by spring, 26 by harvest, 43 by the next December, written on index cards and kept in a wooden recipe box Doris gave her after one corner cracked. The work remained modest. Jam labels, memorial cards, wedding place cards, baptism certificates, a run of thank-you notes for a quilt shop, a small broadside of a Wendell Berry poem requested by a schoolteacher who had permission printed out and folded in her purse. Elara accepted only what she could do well. She turned down more than she took. People respected that after a while. They learned that the shop did not rush. They learned that proofs came wrapped in brown paper with penciled notes. They learned that misspelled names were corrected without shame, and that a widow ordering funeral cards could sit by the stove as long as she needed before choosing type. They learned that the young woman behind the counter charged fairly, kept receipts exact, and sometimes placed an extra card in the packet without mentioning it. Caleb made the sign. He arrived in late March with his pickup bed covered by a tarp and a grin he tried to suppress because solemnity had become, at 19, a coat he liked to wear badly. By then he had begun apprenticing with a carpenter near Gap. His hands had changed. Broader. More nicked. Surer around tools. He asked Elara to come outside. The board lay across 2 sawhorses. Black walnut. Hand-planed. Edges softened but not rounded too much. The letters were carved deeply. Not painted flat. Each one shaped with a care that made the words appear grown from the wood rather than imposed on it. Wenger and Daughters. Letterpress and binder. Below the words, he had carved the little press mark from the key, the cellar slab, and the brass plate in the walnut tree. 3 short lines beneath the bed. A curve for the lever. A mark simple enough to remember after seeing once. Elara stood in front of it with her hands in her apron pockets. "You spelled daughters plural," she said. "Yes, ma'am. There is only me." Caleb looked toward the shop, then the walnut tree, then the repaired windows where evening light had begun to gather. Not from what I hear. The sign went above the front door on April 2. Gideon held the ladder. Amos argued about screw length. Dora stood with her arms folded and said the left side was a hair low until everyone pretended not to hear her and then adjusted it. Mrs. Kiefer brought a thermos of tea. Reverend Boyd walked past, stopped, and offered 4 words. Bless the honor. When the screws were set and the ladder taken down, Elara stood across the lane and looked at the building. The brick remained weathered. The roof was practical, not picturesque. The chimney showed repair lines. The windows were uneven. The sign looked both new and long overdue. Under it, the front door waited to be opened by hands carrying requests, grief, recipes, names, small celebrations, and the ordinary paper needs by which lives mark themselves. That night, after everyone left, Elara began her own letter. She did not know who it would be for. That was part of the discipline. A letter to a known person becomes too easily an instruction. A letter to the unknown must leave room for mercy. She cleared the work table, trimmed a sheet of cream paper, filled the fountain pen misses. Kiefer had given her from her late husband's desk, and lit the remaining end of the Christmas Eve candle from 1898. There was almost none of it left by then, only a short column of beeswax and a wick that leaned. She had saved it for a night that required witness. This one did. At the top of the page she wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. The shop made its evening sounds around her. Fire settling. Clock ticking. Wind at the repaired putty. A faint creak from the press as metal cooled. Outside, the drainage run moved in darkness. The walnut tree held its horseshoe, its closed brass plate, and whatever living wood had made around both. The cellar slab waited below, still unlifted, the carved press mark brushed clean but unanswered. She wrote slowly. Not about being cast out. Not about Martin. Not about the locked door, the lost tuition, or the silence in the hallway where Lillian had folded a dish towel smaller and smaller. Those things belonged to the road behind her, and the letter was not a road backward. She wrote about how to test a chimney draft with a match, how to warm ink without scorching it, how to tie a figure-8 knot for a sash weight, how old putty behaves in cold weather, how much pressure the tabletop press likes when printing on cotton rag, how to leave the cracked front pane alone unless water begins to enter, how to stand under the walnut tree before deciding anything final. She wrote that inheritance should not make a person grand. She wrote that hidden money is only useful when it becomes time, shelter, heat, bread, and careful work. She wrote that loneliness lies by telling a person they are the first to suffer and the last to be helped. She wrote the names she knew now: Miriam, Clara, Jonas, Matthias, Abraham, Paul, Samuel, Daniel, Elias, Adeline, Amos, Doris, Gideon, Caleb, Boyd. She left space after them, because a house that keeps living must keep making room for names not yet written. The candle burned low enough to drown its wick. Before it went out, she added one more line. The shop is not mine in the way a coin is mine. I am only keeping it warm. The flame guttered. A thread of smoke rose, blew and brief, then disappeared into the room. In later years, customers would sometimes ask how she came to own the shop, and Elara would tell them a shortened truth, because most people do not know what to do with a whole one. She would say there had been a county sale, and the place needed work, and several neighbors were kinder than they had to be. If they pressed, she would smile and ask whether they wanted black ink or brown, cream stock or gray, folded cards or flat. The whole truth remained in the letter, in the repair manual, in the ledger, in the fire safe, in the key, in the walnut tree, in the cellar slab not yet lifted. Some stories do not ask to be displayed. They ask to be kept in working order. By the second winter after reopening, the shop had found its rhythm. Morning fire. Kettle. Sweep. Unlock. Sort yesterday's type back into proper cases. Check orders. Print only what hands could print without haste. At noon, soup from a jar. Bread from Doris if she had been excessive again, or beans warmed in a pot if not. Afternoon for binding, trimming, proofs, correspondence, and repairs. Evening for the letter to the next inheritor, a page at a time. Elara never returned to the house in York. She never sought explanation from Martin, never demanded an apology from Lillian, never placed her life before them as evidence. The world is full of rooms where justice never arrives in a form that satisfies witnesses. She learned to leave some doors closed, not because what happened was acceptable, but because her hands were needed elsewhere. On a cold night in late December, she took the original $3 receipt from the deed envelope and made a small paper folder for it. The ink had faded badly, and the thermal paper had begun to yellow. She copied the details by hand on acid-free paper. Parcel number, date of transfer, minimum bid, amount paid. Then she placed the original in the fire safe beside Miriam's letter and Clara's note from the walnut tree. The $3 bills themselves were gone into county accounting, dispersed into drawers and deposits and whatever ordinary channels money follows after leaving a desperate hand. But one of them, the torn corner bill, did not travel far. Mrs. Kiefer had recognized it months after the sale when balancing petty cash at the annex. She had exchanged it with 3 singles from her own purse, not because it was valuable, but because some pieces of paper become witnesses without asking. She kept it in the back of her desk drawer, beneath the stone shaped like a sleeping cat, folded once inside an envelope marked Wenger Place. She never told Elara until years later. By then, the bill had softened further at the crease, and the purple stamp had faded almost away. Elara held it at the clerk's counter and saw again the paper sleeve of her library card, the $3 hidden there, the bus shoulder, the hay barn, the walk past walnut trees, the deed stamp coming down hard and exact. She handed it back. "You should keep it, Mrs." Kiefer said. "No," Elara answered. "It waited with you first." The clerk accepted that. She returned the bill to the envelope to the drawer, and the drawer to its quiet place beneath public maps, deed forms, peppermints, pens, and the daily machinery by which a county keeps track of land while land keeps older records of its own. The letterpress shop waits. It has always waited. Not passively. Not emptily. It waits the way a press waits for ink, the way type waits in its case, the way a seed waits in winter ground, the way a page waits under a hand that has finally learned not to hurry. It waits in brick, in oiled pine, in lime plaster, in old glass, in the walnut tree, in the sealed fire safe, in the letter begun for a stranger, in the names set carefully and returned to their drawers. And on certain evenings, when snow begins again over Lancaster County and the road grows hushed beyond the repaired windows, Elara banks the fire, covers the press, checks the side door, and stands for a moment with her palm on the counter worn by lives she never met. The shop is not empty. It has been waiting. Then she turns down the lamp, leaving only the front window lit long enough for any traveler on Queen Road to see that someone is still keeping the place warm.